Chapter 553. There had to be something fishy going on. Seeing how Zeisman was roaring furiously and fighting ferociously, Twain suspected that the people from the Temple of Light had a hidden trump card. Also, looking at the Holy Light Knights who were about to collapse, they would see this backup plan soon. Just as expected, very quickly, Tang received a positive result from his judgment. David returned with his men. He searched the left side of the canyon, which was the direction they had come from. Lying on the hill, he shook his head and said, "Boss, there's no movement behind us." Tang nodded calmly. He wasn't surprised at all. All the members of the gray space had a strong anti-tracking ability. Also, they had moved very quickly. If someone wanted to take advantage of them, it was impossible not to be discovered. He had asked David to search in the opposite direction, mainly out of caution. A moment later, he hurried back with his men from the other side. Before he could catch his breath, he said with an ugly expression, "Boss, the situation isn't good." 3 kilometers away from the canyon, a Holy Light Knight is leading a large group of gray flame soldiers with heavy weapons. They're expected to arrive in 10 minutes. What? They're really here? David's body shook as he cried out involuntarily. "Phew, wait, I'm not done yet." Pausing for a moment, Luke grinned and took a deep breath. "We discovered the enemy on this mountain peak. Behind this large group of blue flame soldiers, there are still a few more soldiers rushing over. The fog is too thick, so we can't see the exact number, but there are at least 10,000 of them." Everyone looked at each other and opened their mouths. If they were shocked earlier, they were completely speechless now. 10,000 soldiers. What kind of concept was that? Not to mention the barbarians in front of them. Even the onlookers had to avoid them first. But if they really did that, their plan this time could only be aborted before it was even born. Tang frowned. After a moment of silence, he said calmly, "Heavy weapons? What heavy weapons? Also, how far are the soldiers in front from the army behind?" Luke thought for a moment and said, "There are 3 heavy weapons. They look like Mjolnir, but they're slightly smaller and require about 50 to 60 soldiers to carry them. I think it's the thunder roar that Brother Fry introduced." "Thunder God roar?" Tang raised his head and thought for a while. He quickly remembered the information about Thunder God's roar that Fry had mentioned during their chat. In fact, the so-called Thunder God's roar was basically the same as Mjolnir in terms of appearance, operation, and usage. The only difference was that Thunder God's roar was slightly smaller in size and correspondingly weaker in power. However, being small also had its advantages. Due to the size, weight, and recoil of Mjolnir when launched, it could only be used to defend a city. It was very difficult for it to be useful in a field battle. The Thunder God's roar, on the other hand, was different. As long as the Thunder God's roar was a chariot made of special materials, it could roam around the wilderness and attack. If one wanted to enter mountainous terrain or other complicated terrain, even though the war chariots would not be able to enter, as long as the soldiers of Ashen Flame were like the soldiers of Ashen Flame, they would have to work a little harder and take turns to carry the chariots. As for the distance, well, the army behind us will need about half an hour to get here. 10 minutes, half an hour. After pondering for a moment, Tang's expression suddenly changed. His long and narrow eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at the opposite hill. The corners of his mouth rose. So that's how it is. The crazy battle at the foot of the hill continued. But at this time, the people of the Temple of Light had almost retreated to the entrance of the valley. The situation was not optimistic. Damn it. Why aren't they here yet? As time went by, Sessman's expression became more and more panicked. He looked at the surrounding hills and muttered anxiously. Then, he saw the broken body of a great magician lying not far from him. Well, he hurriedly looked away. That's right. Just a moment ago, the Temple of Light lost an expert. The main reason was that the Holy Light Knights couldn't hold on for long, and the barbarians who were crazily attacking opened up a gap. That great magician happened to be next to them, and he was instantly hit by a flurry of attacks. Originally, these ordinary barbarians wouldn't be able to break through the magic shield in a short time. At most, they would just make the great magician a little flustered. However, The nearby close combat experts of the savage evil cult saw this opportunity and simultaneously abandoned their opponents in front of them. They madly rushed over and joined forces to attack the great magician together. Of course, that great magician couldn't withstand this kind of attack, and his magic shield was instantly broken. Before he could scream for help, the sky full of iron rods had already smashed down. It was a pity that this great magician of the Temple of Light had died in the hands of a group of ordinary barbarians. Moreover, he was almost smashed into meat paste. It was a pity that fate wasn't on his side. This unforeseen event was too sudden, and it happened right next to Sessman. When he saw this, he felt a chill run down his spine and was stunned on the spot. Fortunately, Sylvia and a few other head commanders realized that something was wrong and quickly went back to help. After paying a price to kill 2 evil cult experts, they barely managed to stabilize the situation. Of course, everyone knew that this wasn't a coincidence. The Holy Light Knights couldn't hold on for much longer. If they waited a little longer, this kind of situation would happen again and again. Damn it. I told you not to use this risky strategy to lure the enemy in, but now we are all going to be wiped out before we can kill them. Damn it. Where are the reinforcements? Cursing Sylvia and the others, cursing the delayed reinforcements. The uncontrollable fear made Sessman curse crazily in his heart. On the outside, he didn't hesitate to use all kinds of magic spells to bombard the enemies. Needless to say, Sessman's crazy attacks made the people in black robes very uncomfortable. For a moment, he actually managed to turn the situation around a little. At this moment, if it was someone who had been through hundreds of battles, he would definitely take advantage of the situation and use a reasonable method to attack one of the targets. This way, he might be able to achieve a good result. However, Sessman was purely lucky. Not only did he not get back on track in time, but after seeing that the situation had turned for the better, he became complacent and continued to attack in a daze. The most important thing was to win by surprise. The danger was actually not much lower than the opponent, so it shouldn't be used often. This was like a surprise tactic. If used occasionally, it might lead to unexpected results. However, if one got used to it and was seen through by the opponent, it would often lead to one's death. Sessman's stupid actions were no doubt like this. Not only did the situation not turn for the better, but it also allowed the enemy to adjust and cooperate with the close combat experts to launch a wave of counterattacks. Some of the people in black robes looked at the low-level magic spells hitting the defensive barrier and smiled contemptuously. They even had time to attack the Holy Light Knights around them. The huge difference in strength naturally brought great pressure to the Holy Light Knights, and the defensive line was in danger. Calm down, Sessman. Seeing that the situation was getting worse, Sylvia took the time to turn around and immediately shouted with a frown. Even with her domineering strength, she still paused for a while before saying these words. It was easy to imagine how much pressure she was under. Sessman, who was immersed in panic and excitement, was startled when he heard Sylvia's words. His magic attacks also stopped. Sessman, you Sai-ha-ha idiot. Quick, go. Lancelot looked up and laughed loudly. He waved his silver feather sword and led all the close combat experts to rush towards Sylvia and the rest who were sighing. Without a doubt, Sessman had done something stupid again. Sylvia only asked him to calm down, but she did not ask him to stop attacking. The Holy Light Knights were already struggling to cope with the situation. Now that they suddenly lost the support of a great sorcerer like Sessman, the situation became even worse. The defensive line was about to be broken. Seeing that he had made a big mistake, Sessman panicked. He quickly chanted a spell and threw it toward the barbarians. However, it was too late. Before his spell could reach the top of the barbarians' heads, it was blocked by the black gas that the barbarians had prepared. At this moment, bang, 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 roar, roar, roar. The white figures flew back one after another, blood splattering in the air. With the support of the people in black robes, the barbarian warriors on both sides finally succeeded in breaking through the defensive line formed by the Holy Light Knights. They patted their chests and roared excitedly. It's over. At this moment, the shadow of failure loomed over everyone in the Temple of Light. Phew! Suppressing the strong regret in her heart, Sylvia suddenly took a deep breath. Her flamed spear shook, and the holy combat ray burst out like a tide. Lancelot and the rest who were besieging the barbarians hurriedly dodged. At this moment, Sylvia leaped up and shouted, "Everyone listen to my order, retreat." Before she could finish her words, suddenly, boom. Chapter 554. The people from the Temple of Light had lost all hope as the battle had progressed to this stage. Not to mention the strategy of luring the enemy. The only way to ensure the survival of more people was to directly retreat. However, just as Sylvia gave the order to retreat, boom, the sound of the explosion echoed throughout the valley. The sound of the explosion was obviously different from the sound of combat energy collision. Not only was it louder, but it was also much clearer. The next moment, everyone looked up and saw hundreds of burly figures flying into the air. Most of them were still in good shape, and they crashed into the mountain wall. Red and white viscous liquid stained the wall instantly. The ones that flew higher were the ones in the middle. However, most of them were missing parts. When they reached the highest point, they fell down together with a rain of blood. Oh, it was the barbarians. Before the people present could recover from their shock, all of a sudden, boom, boom, another 2 explosions were heard. These 2 explosions were closer to the center of the battlefield than the first. Due to the attack, the barbarians were crowded together. As a result, even more figures flew out, and some even flew over Xiao Weian and the others' heads. Everyone suddenly turned their heads and looked at the hill on the side. Then, 2 different exclamations were heard. Thunder, roar. Damn it, we've fallen into their trap. Ha, it's here, it's finally here. At the top of the hill, 3 long pipes that were almost close to the ground stretched out. They were aimed at the barbarians' camp. At this moment, there was still smoke coming out of the opening of the pipes. Against the cold metal behind the pipes, there was a chilling feeling of cruelty. After 3 loud noises, hundreds of archers wearing Tsang Yin standard armor suddenly appeared beside the metal pipe with their bows drawn and arrows pointed downwards. At the same time, the people behind the pipes seemed to be busy with something. Needless to say, they must be loading the exploding crystals. At this moment, whoosh, 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 the sharp sound of air being pierced was heard. Thousands of silver lightsabers emerged from the battlefield and attacked the top of the hill quickly. Lancelot reacted and attacked. His face was gloomy as he raised both of his hands. The physical silver feather sword floated in front of him. It was shining as if it could sense the lightsabers above it. This place was a canyon that couldn't be any more perfect. The 3 thunder gods' roars from above were just too powerful. Not to mention the ordinary barbarian warriors. Even if they were experts, it would be hard to tell whether they would live or die if they took a direct hit from the cannon. Therefore, they had to find a way to destroy these things. However, Lancelot wasn't the only one to react. The other experts from the Temple of Light also snapped out of their daze. Without saying anything, Sylvia took the lead and attacked Lancelot with her spear. Then, a great mage raised his staff, his lips trembling as he muttered to himself. A milky white light quickly descended from the sky, directly blocking the mountainside, forming a semicircular light shield. Bang, 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 bang. The sound of raindrops hitting banana leaves rang out unceasingly. The myriad of silver light swords were like moths flying into a flame as they directly collided with the milky white light barrier. Loud bangs rang out, and the silver light swords instantly collapsed upon contact, scattering into silver specks that filled the sky. At the same time, the milky white light shield was also fluctuating. Its light dimmed a lot, and it looked like it was about to shatter. Obviously, in comparison, Lancelot's silver light swords were more powerful. However, at this moment, Sessman, who had just escaped death, quickly waved his staff to make up for his stupid mistake earlier. Immediately, a light shield covered the area again. This was the advantage of a mage. As long as they were within the coverage of their magic, they could attack or defend regardless of the distance. Phew! Lancelot looked up and sighed. knowing that his attack would be futile. He turned his head to look at Sylvia, who was charging at them with an overwhelming force. He then looked at the few Temple of Light experts who were consciously moving at the side of the hill. He could not help but shake his head. The mountains on both sides could be easily climbed from the outside, but from the inside, it looked like a cliff. There were a few experts who could climb up, but the barbarians had already moved to the foot of the hill to block them. They had not been able to kill the barbarians earlier, so naturally, it was impossible for them to climb up the hill now. As for the ordinary barbarian warriors, there were enough of them, but the moon would be out by the time they climbed up the hill. The situation was obvious. Naturally, the dozens of experts from the wild wilderness could see that. They looked at each other, their expressions extremely grim. They did not have to think about attacking. Thunder God Roar would hit them a few times, and their attack would be disintegrated instantly. Even if they wanted to retreat, it wouldn't be easy to do so. They had gone too deep into the canyon when they were chasing after Yu Yang. Under such an open field of vision, the power of Thunder God's roar would undoubtedly be at its greatest. In just a short while, the Northern Wilderness experts were at a loss as to what to do. They had actually fallen into an awkward situation where they could neither advance nor retreat. "Let's retreat." Lancelot sighed helplessly as he put away his silver feather sword and dodged Sylvia's attack. Attacking could not kill the barbarians, but retreating could save as many of their people as possible. After analyzing the differences in detail, it was naturally clear which choice to make. The Northern Wilderness experts were conflicted when they heard that. However, no matter how unwilling they were, they could only grit their teeth and accept the result now. One of the cult experts turned his head and suggested, after attacking the aggressive Sylvia, "Let's break through the barbarians and break out from behind them." What they needed to do now was to lead the barbarian warriors out of the canyon as quickly as possible so that they would not be hit by Thunder God Roar. As such, the valley entrance behind the group of people from the Temple of Light was undoubtedly the best choice. However, just as he finished speaking, a deafening battle cry came from the canyon entrance. "Kill! Kill! Kill!" The pale flame soldiers in standard armor charged into the canyon endlessly, waving their weapons as they rushed over. F*CK. There was no need to hesitate now. Lancelot cursed angrily and decisively raised his head and roared, "Retreat, everyone retreat. Spread out as much as you can." In reality, there was no need for Lancelot to remind them. After hearing the clear order to retreat, all the barbarians had already spread out in the empty canyon and ran for their lives. Bran and the Northern Wilderness have been fighting for so many years. One was wary of the other party's insane physique and strength, while the other was fearful of the other party's various killing weapons. The ordinary barbarians had suffered a lot from killing weapons like Thunder God Roar. No matter how stupid they were, they would be able to come up with a set of methods to avoid it. At this moment, the Thunder God Roar on the hill had finally finished reloading. The metal body suddenly trembled, and 3 pieces of explosive crystals glowing in a dangerous red light flew out rapidly. Before the naked eye could see them, they had already exploded in the middle of the barbarians who were running away. Boom! 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 Gravel flew everywhere, and shadows flew everywhere. At this moment, there was a collective buzzing sound in everyone's head. They could not hear anything else at all. The power was still the same, but the effect this time was not as spectacular as the last time. The barbarians' technique of spreading out was still very practical. After 3 shots, only less than 100 barbarians were killed. It was not even as powerful as the previous shot. However, this was only temporary. The shooting range of Thunder God Roar was not short. As long as the angle of the metal tube was adjusted gradually, it would not be a problem to cover the long canyon. Compared to the ordinary barbarians who were frightened by the explosions and were afraid that the explosive crystals would fall on their heads, Lancelot and the rest were not as worried, as they were now fighting Sylvia and the rest. The situation was the opposite of before. Lancelot and the rest wanted to retreat, while Sylvia and the rest wanted to kill the barbarians. If both parties were to compare the number of experts, the Temple of Light would undoubtedly have fewer experts. Therefore, the evil cult experts would naturally be freed up. However, they could not retreat first because if they were to fight one-on-one, they would not be able to defeat Sylvia and the rest. If they were to fight alone, they would definitely die. Therefore, they could only turn around and save the barbarians. In the end, none of them were able to leave. Of course, this would not work. If the gray flame soldiers behind them surrounded them, none of them would be able to leave. Some of the evil cult experts looked at each other as they fought. Their eyes were flickering and they were thinking of retreating. In such an intense battle, if one of them were to retreat, it would undoubtedly cause the death of his companions. However, humans were selfish. The barbarians were humans too. Moreover, these were intelligent barbarian experts. Naturally, they were no exception. Moreover, if one were to hesitate and his companions ran away, would he not be the unlucky one in the end? Doubt, suspicion. The evil cult experts who were gradually distracted from the battle were no match for Sylvia and the rest. Finally, one of the evil cult experts who was stabbed in the abdomen by Sylvia's spear shrieked and rolled out. He did not wait to check on his injuries. He pressed against the ground and fled like an arrow. How dare you? Damn it. F***CKU. Chapter 555. F***CKU. The cult master's sudden escape infuriated his companions, especially Lancelot, Tulu, and the rest. As they had higher abilities, they attracted the most attention and were held back by Sylvia and the rest. If the others still had the chance to escape, they would be exposing their defenseless backs to their opponents as soon as they turned around. They were courting death. Moreover, such an action was undoubtedly a serious blow to their morale. If the many masters in the northern wilderness had worked together before, they might have been able to achieve a better outcome. Not everyone could escape unscathed, but at least most of them could have escaped. However, there was no need to think about that now. It was foreseeable that more people would run away soon. Haha. Kill, kill, kill. Heretics, surrender yourselves obediently. Let God's light cleanse your sinful souls. He waved his staff and released all sorts of destructive spells, drowning one of the cult masters. Sessman's face was flushed. He was so excited that he could barely contain his excitement. Now, these cultist experts were no longer human beings in his eyes. They were credits on his resume, stepping stones on his way to the top of the temple. Although his words were arrogant, they were not empty words. Compared to the cult masters who harbored complicated thoughts, the Temple of Light's group was undoubtedly more united. It was precisely because of this that they were now suppressing their opponents. Moreover, their battle results were increasing. Boom, boom, boom. Everyone, I'm sorry. After Thunder God Roar was released again, one of the cult masters finally could not take the pressure anymore. He shrieked and unleashed his most powerful ability, regardless of friend or foe, in an attempt to escape temporarily. As soon as he unleashed his power, his companions who were closest to him were undoubtedly in trouble. They had to defend against the Temple of Light's attacks while avoiding being stabbed in the back by their own people. They roared angrily and instantly fell into a desperate situation. Lancelot's heart sank when he saw this. He knew that there was nothing he could do to turn the situation around. He blocked Sylvia's overbearing attack with all his might while retreating to Tulu's side. He gave Tulu a subtle look. Tulu was stunned for a moment and nodded in understanding. Selfishness was scary, but what was scarier was that others were the same as well. At this point, as long as Lancelot wanted to live, he had to do this regardless of whether he wanted to escape or not. Knowing that, it was not surprising that Lancelot would look for Turo. If both of them could work together, their chances of escaping would undoubtedly be higher. Moreover, Lancelot and Tulu had known each other for a long time. Their friendship was enough for them to trust each other. With a jolt of their bodies, both of them switched positions in an instant. Tulu was in front while Lancelot was behind him. They unleashed their attacks at the same time. Roar. Scram. Silver, feather, thousand swords. Open. Tulu's tower-like tall and sturdy body doubled in size once again. Under the cover of the orange-yellow light, a barbaric aura instantly filled the whole place, as if he was an ancient giant. Lancelot's body was blocked by Tulu, so they could not see what it was doing. However, looking at the dense silver lightsabers that appeared all of a sudden, they knew that the attack was powerful. Their opponent was Sylvia. They had fought against each other many times and knew each other well. Sylvia naturally wasn't afraid. With a tender shout, the blazing flames on her spear rose in the wind, wantonly and enchanting. She calmly thrust out her spear, directly facing Tu Lu's lunging fist. Boom! It was a solid collision. Instantly, waves of chi ripples rippled out, and the ground trembled. Pfft! Ah! Tu Lu let out a series of angry roars again. His feet left the ground, and he flew backward while spewing a bloody mist. To be honest, Tu Lu was really unwilling to admit defeat. With his overbearing strength and secret skills, he was almost invincible. However, as soon as he came into contact with this terrifying woman before him, he could only retreat in all sorts of ways. He flew backward, retreated from the impact, and retreated while spewing blood. Moreover, she defeated him head-on every single time. He had no choice but to admit defeat. With a shake of her body, Sylvia took a step back. Pursing her lips, she charged forward again. The powerful collision earlier might have injured her, but this was a rare opportunity. She did not want to let the two of them escape before her eyes again. With a low grunt, Lancelot caught Tu Lu, who was flying backward. His giant weight and the powerful impact made Lancelot's face turn red instantly. Blood rushed to his throat, but he swallowed it forcefully. He took a step forward, swung his arm, and roared, "Go!" Whoosh! Tu Lu's tower-like giant body turned and flew out, flying over the top of the few cult masters' heads. "Go!" With another loud roar, the densely packed silver sword around him surged out like a tidal wave, attacking Sylvia, who was charging at him rapidly. Without stopping, Sylvia inhaled slightly. With a shake of her wrist, a dazzling white glow erupted from her flaming spear. She shouted coldly, "Break!" Bang, bang, bang. Explosions that were not intense, but extremely dense, rang out continuously. Sylvia charged into the storm of swords with her spear alone. She went against the tide of swords as if she was crushing dry weeds. Tens of thousands of swords avoided her. Puff. Lancelot finally spat out the blood that he had held back earlier. Wiping the corner of his mouth, Lancelot looked at Sylvia, who was like a prehistoric giant beast. The corner of his eyes twitched a few times. Without saying anything, he leaped and left immediately, heading toward the cult masters' heads. Behind him, boom! The rain of swords exploded and flew everywhere. Sylvia rushed out with a determined look on her face. She narrowed her eyes slightly and could not help but frown. Tu Lu and Lancelot did not go far. However, there was another battle between them now. There were two Sacred Head Knight commanders and 4 cult masters fighting fiercely, covering a wide area. Clearly, Lancelot had tricked the 4 of them when they were retreating. No matter if Sylvia chose to go around the battle or kill the 4 of them first, it would buy them time to escape. Without hesitation, Sylvia pursed her lips and charged toward the 4 cult masters with her spear. But before Xiao Weian could get close, the 4 cult elites were the first to fall into disarray. 3 of them did not say anything and chose to flee at the same time. Not only were the 2 Sacred Head Knight commanders stunned, but the remaining cult master was also dumbfounded. He stopped attacking and stared blankly at the 3 fleeing silhouettes in midair. He smirked. F***CKU. As soon as he finished speaking, a blazing spear came crashing down with a swoosh. It was as if the last veil had been pulled away. The unusually intense battle a moment ago had turned into a stage for the Northern Wilderness's experts to show off their escape techniques in the next moment. The more particular ones were self-reliance. For example, they would suddenly explode with their strongest ability to catch their opponents off guard and run away decisively. Or they could use the trick of injuring themselves to gain the enemy's sympathy by forcefully taking an attack that would not kill them and using the force to escape. Of course, the Temple of Light and the rest were not fools. These crude methods might not be effective and might even backfire on them. Therefore, some of the smart and ruthless cult masters would use methods that were not very particular but could ensure their own safety. For example, what Lancelot and the rest had done earlier was considered light. After all, they had only used a little sneak attack and left some leeway. However, when some of them were escaping, they had pushed their comrades who had been fighting alongside them from the back, sending them directly into the enemy's attack. Losing an army was like a landslide, not to mention a dirty comrade stabbing a knife in the back. The outcome was self-evident. Actually, it was easy to explain why such a strange situation had occurred. These people were all experts and did not have any obvious differences in status. Basically, the right to speak was determined by strength. Lancelot and Tulu were the two with the strongest abilities, which meant that they were the vague leaders of this group of experts. Now that they had fled at the last minute, the remaining people naturally had no will to fight. In just a short time, many of the savage wilderness cult masters had either fled or died. Only a few who had reacted slowly or had been framed were left, cursing loudly under the siege. Their lives were at stake. In fact, the Temple of Light was rather stunned by the scene as well. Fortunately, everything was developing in a favorable direction. Sylvia did not participate in the siege. Instead, she passed through the area and quickly chased after Lancelot and the rest who were escaping. "Hey, wait for me." Sessman was naturally unwilling to let half of the credit that was about to be in his hands slip away. He hurriedly said, "Leave a few people to deal with the remaining enemies. The rest of you, follow me and try to kill all of these heretics." Sessman did not have the highest position here, but he could be ranked in the top 3. However, as he did not know much about war and had repeatedly made bad moves, he did not have much authority to speak. However, everyone felt that what he said made sense. Moreover, Sylvia had already chased after them. Therefore, after a simple discussion, a few Grand Mages and Holy Knight commanders retreated from the battle and rushed forward together. Due to their previous collective escape, Lancelot's sneak attack had failed. Naturally, they could not run far in such a short time. In reality, if Lancelot was alone, they might have been able to escape. However, Tulu the Big Guy was not fast. On the contrary, he was rather clumsy. Finally, when they were close to the other end of the valley, they and the other 2 northern wilderness experts who were slower were stopped by Sylvia and the rest. The 4 or 5 black-robed freaks were also stopped. They were mages from the northern wilderness, or more accurately, black mages. However, no matter what kind of mages they would always have weak stamina and slow running speed. In fact, if they were to fly, there was a high chance that they could escape from the pursuit. However, there were 3 thunder roaring above them. They would only become targets if they were to fly recklessly. Since they were stopped, needless to say, it would be an intense battle. Now, the savage cult and the rest were united. Tulu, Lancelot, and the 2 northern wilderness experts were at the front, responsible for blocking and guarding. A few black-robed freaks were hiding at the back, attacking with all kinds of black or magic. With such a clear division of labor, Sylvia and the rest were unable to break through. The battle was in a stalemate again. Of course, everyone knew that this stalemate would not last long. As long as the temple experts at the back got rid of the stubborn cult members and rushed over to support them, they would be the last straw that broke the horse's back. In reality, they were already rushing over. Ha-die-die. Hell is the final destination for you heretics. Sessman was overjoyed when he saw that the situation was turning for the better. Lancelot and the rest did not say anything when they heard that. They really did not have the time to talk nonsense now. They attacked crazily while watching the enemy's reinforcements approach with gloomy expressions. F***, let's fight them. Tulu roared suddenly, interrupting Sessman's nagging. He opened his arms wide and pounced without any regard for defense. F***, let's fight. Lancelot and the 2 cult experts looked at each other and roared in anger. They also charged forward desperately without any regard for defense. In an instant, the battle became white-hot. Everyone was fighting crazily. Even the archmages from the temple and the black-robed freaks no longer paid attention to maintaining their casting distance. They dared to attack the close-range fighters from more than 10 meters away. Of course, Sessman was clear-headed. He shouted the slogan in an unusually solemn and stirring manner. However, he moved his feet backward discreetly. At the same time, he glanced at the reinforcements behind him cautiously. However, the experts present did not know that the ones who would decide the outcome of the battle were not the temple experts who were about to arrive, but a group of troublemakers who were completely disrupting the battle. Behind them, the pale flame soldiers who had rushed in from the valley entrance had finally reached the center of the valley, which was where the battle had taken place. However, at this moment, a series of screams suddenly came from above. Because of the fierce collision in front of them, the soldiers did not immediately notice this abnormality. When they felt that something was wrong, the soldiers who were running at the front opened their mouths and looked up, but their vision suddenly turned black. Plop, 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 like dumplings, black figures fell from the sky. Some of them fell on the ground and instantly formed a human-shaped pit. Some of them directly fell on the unlucky soldiers below and rolled to the side. The screams and screams stopped abruptly, and they became silent. Phew. The soldiers at the back were all shocked by the scene in front of them. They subconsciously retreated in panic. When they came back to their senses, they realized that the ones who had fallen were their comrades who had separated from them earlier, the pale flame archers who were wearing standard armor. They suddenly raised their heads. Under the shocked gazes of the soldiers, they saw a few black figures standing on the peak of the mountain. They were waving, thick tree trunks in their hands. As if they were chasing ducks down the river, they directly swept their comrades down the mountain. However, this was not the most shocking thing. The thunder god's roar that had stopped firing when the ordinary barbarians ran out of the valley actually slowly raised its metal body and moved slowly to the right. That was where the powerful figures from the Temple of Light and the experts from the northern wilderness were fighting fiercely. Soon, the hundreds of archers who were caught off guard were all pushed down, and the body of the metal tube suddenly stopped. Then a few soft voices floated down from the peak of the mountain with the wind. How did those people do it just now? TSK, if you can't do it, stand aside. Yes, I remember it was this small wrench. Boss, are you sure? I heard that if you press the wrong button, it will self-destruct. Relax. I succeeded in kicking the Thunder God's hammer back then. Can I deal with this low-level Thunder God's roar? Are you kidding me? Kick, load, close, and calibrate. Yes, it's done. Cough, then. Pause for a while, mixed with that's it. Boss, do you want to check again? And other frightened voices. The unreliable voice from before suddenly raised its pitch. Roar, Thunder God. Bang. The metal tube suddenly shook, and a red fireball instantly crossed the distance of a few thousand meters. It pierced through the layers of smoke and quickly fell into the valley on the right, like a comet falling to the ground. Oh God, no, it's over. At this moment, the soldiers at the foot of the mountain were in an out-of-body state. They stared blankly at the meteor that flew across their vision and fell. Boom! Debris flew everywhere, and dust filled the sky. The violent explosion rang through the valley again, and the aftershocks continued. F***CK. Oh, God of Light. At the foot of the mountain, there were two completely different cries of surprise. That's right, the cannon missed its target and landed on the left side of the mountain, where the experts from both sides were fighting, creating a huge hole in the ground. This result was not surprising. In the army, those who operated such heavy weapons were the best of the best, and in order to ensure accuracy, they had to be trained one shot at a time. This was Tangen's first time trying it out. It was already a blessing from the gods that he was able to guarantee a successful shot and did not press the self-destruct button. Mother ****, again. He was going to do it again. Hearing the fierce voice coming from above, the soldiers immediately came back to their senses. They looked at each other in fear. There were 3 thunder roars above. After a few adjustments, it was possible to hit the target. However, if the target was hit, the Temple of Light would be defenseless. Damn. Master, be careful from above. Thinking of this, a soldier jumped up like a rabbit that had been shot by an arrow and shouted a warning. Unfortunately, It was futile. Both sides were still a few thousand meters apart. Moreover, the people from the Temple of Light were fighting with Lancelot and the rest crazily. They could not afford to be distracted at all as they were fighting with their lives on the line. In addition to the repeated attacks, the loud explosion did not stop, and it completely covered the surrounding sounds. Of course, this did not mean that all the experts did not notice this unusual situation. It was hard to say for sure, but Zeisman, who had been working without putting in any effort to ensure his own safety, had definitely noticed it. After all, the rolling rocks and the huge hole in the mountain wall were clearly visible to the naked eye. However, even if he had noticed this, he would not have thought that the thunder roars on his side had changed owners. Therefore, he looked at the mountain peak behind him in a daze, wondering if there was a misfire. No, the masters won't be able to hear us if we shout like this. Damn it, who are they? How'd they get up there? What do we do now? If we go back the way we came and climb up the mountain, it'll be too late. Damn it, be quiet. A person who looked like a captain punched his fist and pointed at the few soldiers in front of him. Go and inform the masters now. We'll go back the way we came and kill those bastards. Before he could finish his sentence, a soldier shouted, Captain, look! Everyone suddenly looked up and gulped. The metal pipe above them moved slowly again as if it was calibrating. This time there were two pipes. Chapter 556. Look again, look again. You must hit the target this time. TCH. Stop talking. Can't you see that I'm nervous? And, after reloading, press this wrench again. Hey, Luke, I think boss pressed the one beside you. Mistake. Haha, just a mistake. Needless to say, Tang Yin and the people from Gray Space were at the top of the mountain. After calmly analyzing Luke's discovery, Tang Yin accurately realized that the two groups of gray flame soldiers had different objectives. He still didn't know the intentions of the 10,000 soldiers at the back, but the large group of gray flame soldiers at the front were undoubtedly reinforcements that had arrived first. It could be said that if the two groups of soldiers had come together, Tang Yin and the others would have had no chance and could only retreat. But now that there was a 10-minute time difference between the two groups of soldiers, there was something to be done. That was indeed the case. After the large group of soldiers arrived, they split into two groups. One group consisted of more than 100 archers and a few technical soldiers. They carried Thor's hammer and walked up the gentle slope to the top of the mountain. The other group consisted of a few hundred melee soldiers. They went around the mountain and entered the canyon from the side to provide support. Seeing this, Tang Yin and the others were undoubtedly more confident. They silently crept up the mountain and hid at the side to observe. Yes, at first, they were just observing. None of them knew how to control Thor's roar, and this thing really couldn't be messed around with because it would self-destruct if they weren't careful. So, they could only watch from the side and secretly learn. It was only when the situation at the bottom of the mountain changed that Tang Yin gave the order to attack. The result was as expected. In order to protect the Thor's roar, the hundreds of archers stood at the top of the mountain and focused their attention on the ground below. They didn't know that these fiends were coming from behind. However, although they had the Thor's roar and knew how to use it, it didn't mean that they could hit it accurately. Tang Yin's probing shot was undoubtedly a problem. Seeing this, Tang Yin was straightforward. If one shot didn't work, then he would try two and try a few more times. According to probability, there was bound to be a shot that would hit the target. Currently, Tang Yin and Luke were operating the two thunder roars. In the gray space, these two people were the best at archery. Although Thunder God's roar and archery had nothing to do with each other, the archer's mysterious premonition of the target was more or less the same. Are you ready? After Tang Yin calibrated his machine, he touched the wrench and turned to look at Luke, who was a little nervous. Tang Yin aimed at the red-robed Sessman, and Luke aimed at the center of the battlefield. As for whether or not they would accidentally injure him, what did that have to do with them? Luke nodded and rubbed his hands. He subconsciously drew the Temple of Light's blessing on his chest. Seeing this, Tang Yin snorted and didn't think much of it. They were already preparing to kill someone else's underlings, and now they were counting on the boss to help them. That was ridiculous. Pondering for a moment, he said, "Oh, Amit Bodhisattva, bless Amen, Amen, fire." After quickly saying a bunch of random prayers, Tang and suddenly roared and pressed the two wrenches almost at the same time. Bang! Bang! The thunder god's roar shook its entire steel body. Tang In and the others felt a buzzing sound in their ears, and a wave of heat instantly hit them in the face. Then, two fireballs flew out of their sight and landed in front of the valley in beautiful arcs. Hit! Oh, there's hope! Amidst a series of exclamations, there was an explosion. Boom! Boom! The trajectory of Luke's shot was the most similar, but when it was about to reach the battlefield, it didn't have enough momentum and directly exploded 100 meters behind the battlefield. Tang Yin's shot was even higher, so everybody could only watch as the fireball flew over Sessman's head and exploded in front of the battlefield. The shockwave spread out and blew two evil cult experts in black robes into the air. It hit. F*CK, it was so close. F*CK. Everybody on the mountain top pounded their chests and stamped their feet in regret. Tang Yin scratched his head, rather depressed. Since his shot could blow two evil cult experts into the air, it naturally wasn't far from the center of the battlefield. Unfortunately, a hair's breadth away was like 1,000 miles. In the end, he still missed his target, at the center of the battlefield. Compared with the regretful Tang In and the others, the experts here were undoubtedly frightened. Their hands paused as they stared blankly at the two evil cult black mages who had been blown into the air. One of them waved his arms and legs wildly as he crashed into the side of the mountain. Bang! His brain was splattered, and it looked like he was dead. The other cried out in shock as he flew over Lancelot and the others' heads and fell. Poof! Instinctively, she raised her spear and directly pierced through the black-robed man who had been sent to her. Even though Sylvia was usually calm, she couldn't help but blink inexplicably. Her determined face was full of astonishment. What's going on? Thunder God's roar. Stroking his chin, a Holy Knight commander said hesitantly, Is that soldier's skill really that good? Everybody was stunned when they heard that. Then, they looked at the black-robed man who had crashed into the mountain wall, and then at the corpse on Sylvia's spear. They couldn't help but gasp in shock. F*CK. That can't be. Scratching his head, Lancelot cursed with a conflicted expression. The explosion of Thunder God's roar had undoubtedly caused great damage to the evil cult. Naturally, Lancelot and the rest were scared out of their wits as they broke out in cold sweat. The reason why they didn't care about Thunder God's roar earlier was that they had been fighting Sylvia and the rest. Thinking about it, the enemy should not have dared to bomb them for fear of harming the innocent. However, looking at the situation before them, it was clear that there was a person among the enemy soldiers whose skill and mentality were at the peak of perfection. He had forcefully brushed past them and directly caused damage to the black-robed man who was more than 10 meters away. How powerful was that? Damn it! How? How dare you? Similarly, Sessman and the rest were shocked too. The fear in their hearts was no less than Lancelot and the rest's. That was the F*King Thunder God's roar. If their hands trembled slightly, or if there was a slight error in their aim, the explosive crystal might very well explode on their heads. How could this not cause their hearts to turn ice cold and a chill to run down their spines? Just when everybody was stunned where they were, an urgent roar came from behind. Sir, be careful. Whoosh. Thunder God's roar isn't controlled by our people. It was the few soldiers who came to warn them. In reality, they had been shouting all the while. However, their voices only came into everyone's ears when their hands stopped moving and the battlefield was really quiet. The battlefield was suddenly quiet. Subsequently, retreat. Let's go. Let's get out of the canyon. Both parties made the same choice almost at the same time and ran towards the canyon exit in front of them. Needless to say, the people from the Temple of Light were panicking. They were a few miles away from where Thunder God's roar was fired. It was impossible for them to attack it. However, if they turned back, they were not confident that they would not be hit on the head. The only thing they could do now was to get out of the canyon to ensure their safety. Meanwhile, Lancelot and the rest were overjoyed to hear that. They thought that the few companions who had escaped earlier had found their conscience and turned back to snatch Thundergod's roar. However, even so, judging from the fact that they had killed 2 of their companions with one shot, their shooting skills were terrible. To avoid dying in their own hands, Lancelot and the rest naturally wanted to get out of the canyon first. At the moment, the loading of Thundergod's roar was completed again on the mountain peak. Not good. Boss, we've been discovered. They're running away, David exclaimed when he saw the figures running towards the canyon exit. Damn, isn't there only one shot left? Looking at the speed at which Sylvia and the others were running and estimating the distance to the canyon exit, Luke immediately felt a lot of pressure. They had spent a lot of effort to occupy this place, hoping that Thundergod's roar would be able to kill the other party. Wouldn't it be a tragedy if their efforts were in vain? Waving his hand, Tang didn't panic at all. Instead, the corners of his mouth curled up into a smile as if everything was under control. Hee, good job running. I was just afraid that they wouldn't run. Pause for a while. He pointed at the 3rd Thundergod's roar that had yet to be operated. Haha, do you still remember? These 3 Thundergod's roars have all been calibrated, and their final target is the canyon exit. We haven't moved this one at all, which means that its landing point hasn't changed. That way, as long as Sessman escapes to the canyon exit, This was Tang's complete plan. When the enemy was near the canyon exit, he would snatch the Thundergod's roar, and then try his luck by shooting a few times. Naturally, it would be better if he hit the target directly. Even if he didn't, the enemy's first choice in their panic would definitely be to escape from the canyon, one step after another, one plan after another. In the end, the goddess of fate stood on Tang-Un's side, and his painstaking plan didn't go to waste. It was needless to say how fast the experts were. Even Sessman and the other mages weren't slow when they flew close to the ground, although they didn't dare fly arrogantly. In the end, the ones who were lagging behind were Tulu, who was covered in wounds, and Lancelot, who was accompanying him. Boom! Boom! At that moment, Tang-In and Luke launched their second attack. Having missed the fixed targets earlier, they naturally couldn't do anything to the moving crowd. In the end, as expected, both attacks missed. Damn! Other people are King protagonists when they transmigrate. Why am I so unlucky? Shaking his head, Tang-In touched his nose rather gloomily. Then, he composed himself and walked to the back of the 3rd Thundergod's roar. He stroked the wrench as if he was stroking the snow-white skin of the most beautiful woman in the world. Forget it. Self-reliance suits me better. He raised his head and looked at the ant-like red-robed figure in the distance. Narrowing his long and narrow eyes, he murmured in a low voice, "Yes, just like that. Run, run, run with all your strength. Sessman, oh Sessman, the day I've been waiting for has finally come. Well, I wonder if you're ready. Get ready to say goodbye to this world. Phew! Come on, come on." Chapter 557. Come on, come on. Sessman and the others weren't slow, and they were getting closer and closer to the entrance of the valley. But somehow, in Tang-In's eyes, they were still moving too slowly. So slow that when Tang-In thought back to 2 years ago, they still hadn't reached the entrance of the valley. It had been nearly 2 years. At that time, he had just transmigrated to another world and was still inexperienced. He wasn't very kind, but the values he had formed under many years of formal education and the external environment hadn't been blown away by the wind and rain of the modern world. Well, to sum it up, he had an inexplicable sense of justice. Ha! In the end, it was his bad luck, or Sessman's bad luck. At that time, he had killed hundreds of villagers, and, at that time, he had met his innocent self. Of course, this naivety and sense of justice was a little laughable in the current situation. Now, his hands were stained with blood. If he opened the so-called yin-yang eye, there would be countless murderous souls floating around him, scratching and biting with ferocious faces. If he thought about it, well, it was really boring. He shook his head, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. His mind was instantly clear. Then he opened his eyes. Tangan raised the corners of his mouth, revealing a happy smile. It was useless to think too much. Everything was coming to an end. It was time to kill Sessman and complete his revenge. It was time to completely say goodbye to his past self. Looking down from above, the faint red-robed figure of Sessman in the distance was about to reach the entrance of the valley. Hiss! David and the others around him unconsciously took a deep breath. Then they quickly held their breaths, their bodies slightly stiff. After such a long time of bloodshed, every member of the gray space was a ruthless person who had killed countless people. They shouldn't be so nervous. But this time, the situation was really different. The other party wasn't a nobody, but a powerful figure in the Temple of Light. And once hit, with the instantaneous explosive power of the Thunder God's roar, it was very likely that more than one or two people would die. Tap, tap, tap. The mountain peak was completely silent. The index finger on the wrench tapped rhythmically, causing the hearts of everyone around to beat along with the rhythm. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. All of a sudden, Tang Un's long and narrow eyes narrowed. The cold light in his eyes was as sharp as a willow leaf, and his palms sank. Bang! After a slight sound of activation, the metal pipe suddenly trembled violently. Bang! A ball of red flame shot out. The two entrances to the valley were the narrowest parts of the canyon. They were several miles apart, and even though they were looking down from a high vantage point, it was still difficult to see who was who. However, Sessman's red-robed figure was rather conspicuous because they had been watching him from the start. At this moment, in Tangan's sight, Sessman's red figure had just stepped onto the narrow passage at the entrance of the valley. Together with him were several archmages from the Temple of Divinity in white or gold robes. In front of them were the black figures of several experts from the northern wilderness. As for the back, it was a head knight in armor that reflected light. Yes, Sylvia was among them. Oh, and at the back, it was Lancelot and Tulu. They hadn't even stepped into the entrance of the valley yet. TSK, giants figures are so easy to recognize. As soon as this thought appeared in Tangan's mind, a flash of fire suddenly appeared in his sight. Instantly, it was filled with surging waves. Boom! Smoke scattered, and dust filled the air. In a short moment, the narrow passage at the entrance of the valley was completely flooded. It hit. Haha, it's done. Although they had expected this, when the exploding crystal really hit the entrance of the valley, everyone on the mountain peak couldn't help but burst into cheers. Boss, we did it! We did it! David turned around and grabbed Tang and shouldered tightly. His face was flushed as he shouted excitedly. Phew! Tang let out a long breath, as if a heavy burden had been lifted. He took a step back, and if David hadn't grabbed him, he would have fallen to the ground. F***, I finally hit it. This time, Sessman is finally dead. Tang couldn't be blamed for losing his composure. It was just that his experience of assassinating Sessman wasn't going well. If he wrote it down and bound it into a book, it would be a tragic history of blood and tears. It's over. Everything is F***ing over. For some reason, amidst the ecstasy, Tang suddenly felt a temporary emptiness in his heart. Yes, everything is over. What should I do next in this strange world? Live in seclusion and pick up girls? Wander around and travel? A few thoughts flashed through Tangan's mind, but they were instantly covered by his joy. Who cares? I'll deal with the future later. Suddenly, just as Tangan was about to go crazy with joy, a hesitant voice sounded in the midst of the cheers. Boss! Sessman seems to have dodged it. The cheers immediately stopped, and the mountain peak instantly fell silent. Stupefied, Tang turned his head stiffly. It was Luke who had spoken. His eyebrows were tightly furrowed, and he looked very hesitant at the moment. He wanted to say something, but didn't. What's going on? Scratching his head, Luke still looked hesitant. I can't be sure. Well, before the explosion at the mouth of the valley, Sylvia seems to have looked back and then seemed to have pushed Sessman in front of her. In the end, She borrowed the force to retreat, and Sessman disappeared in the dust ahead. As mentioned earlier, this place was several kilometers away from the mouth of the valley, and nobody could see the specific situation clearly. But Luke was different. His eyes were exceptionally sharp, and his range of influence was much greater than that of ordinary people. Therefore, when he said seems, the probability of it actually happening was undoubtedly very high. Hearing this, Tang Yin's face instantly turned ashen. The corner of his mouth twitched a few times, and he suddenly turned around and walked directly to the edge of the mountain peak to look at the mouth of the valley where the dust was slowly dispersing. Well, it was just a last-minute push. Maybe Sylvia subconsciously wanted to borrow the force to escape? Well, I think that even if Sylvia wanted to save Sessman, given the range of Thunder God's roar, he would probably still die. That's right. Also, it's possible that the push directly pushed Sessman into the center of the explosion. Seeing that Tang Yin's expression wasn't right, David and the others hesitated for a moment before they all speculated in a favorable direction. It had to be said that these words did make some sense. Even if Sylvia had sensed danger in advance and subconsciously pushed Sessman, who could be sure that this push would send him to heaven? Or to hell? But this wasn't enough to convince Tang Yin. He only needed to confirm one thing now, and that was whether or not what Luke had seen was true. Soon, under the omnipresent cold wind in the north, the dust at the mouth of the valley gradually dispersed. The first thing to appear outside the mouth of the valley were two figures who were sitting on the ground. One was tall, and the other was short. They were Tulu and Lancelot. Because of their slow speed, they hadn't stepped into the mouth of the valley when the explosion occurred, and were lucky enough to escape with their lives. But seeing that they were still in a daze and hadn't moved for a long time, they were probably badly shaken and hadn't come back to their senses yet. Then, the dust around the mouth of the valley also dispersed, and two more figures appeared. Their specific faces couldn't be seen clearly, but the reflected light of the god's grace armor on their bodies undoubtedly revealed their identities. In comparison, one of the figures looked a little thin and curvy. Tang and narrowed his eyes and suddenly raised his head to exhale the foul air in his chest. Needless to say, it had to be Sylvia. She had really backed out. If that was the case, Zeisman had indeed been pushed by her. That be *TCH. Are we *King at odds with each other? Slowly running his fingers through his hair, Tang Yin's expression was conflicted. He was very depressed and speechless. Then he directly took a step forward and sank down to the bottom of the mountain. Thud, thud, thud. His hands were like the wind. The pockmarked dagger kept stabbing into the rocks of the mountain like tofu. Taking advantage of the momentary pause, his rapid fall was slowed down. Within a short span of 10 seconds, Tang Yin's feet pushed against the wall for the last time. His body floated out lightly, and he stepped onto the empty ground in the middle of the valley. Without any pause, he instantly activated his haste skill, and his body rushed forward like the wind. Tang Yin's idea was very simple. As long as he was sure that Sylvia had interfered, he had to take the risk to confirm if Sessman was dead or not. After all, David and the rest had never fought Sylvia before, so they had no idea how terrifying this woman was. Tang Yin didn't believe that Sylvia had pushed him casually. Experts who had been on the battlefield often had a natural sense of danger. Although the speed of Thunder God's roar was so fast that it was beyond what the naked eye could capture, Tang Yin would not be surprised if Sylvia really did something unbelievable at that moment. Chapter 558. His killing intent was fully unleashed as he dashed forward. Tang Yin was terrifying when he unleashed his full speed. He covered a distance of over 100 feet in an instant, as if he had shrunk the ground into an inch. Within a few seconds, the entrance of the valley was right in front of him. Whoosh! Tulu and Lancelot were the first to be overtaken. Both of them were still sitting on the ground at the moment. They were not injured by the explosion and were staring blankly at the entrance of the valley where the smoke had yet to disperse. When Tang Yin rushed past them, both of them shuddered and came back to their senses. They looked at the back of the black-clothed figure that was emitting a chilling aura. They opened their mouths and looked at each other. Who? Who is that? Tulu asked doubtfully as he scratched his head. Tangan's black outfit was obviously different from theirs. Moreover, the northern wilderness powerhouses did not cover their faces when they came here. Lancelot blinked as if he had realized something. He turned around and looked at the mountain peak where the Thunder God's roar was placed. The metal pipe was still there, and there was no one around. However, he could vaguely see dozens of black-clothed people rushing toward them at high speed from the gentle slope of the mountain peak. He touched his forehead and helped Tulu up quickly. Fisk, why do you care so much? Let's run. That makes sense. Let's go. Let's go. As soon as the two of them got up, a silhouette wearing broken God's grace armor near the entrance of the valley supported herself with her arms and half knelt on the ground. She shook her head, and her long hair fluttered in the wind. It was Sylvia. At that moment, Tang In had already arrived. He paused when he saw Sylvia getting up and glanced at her. Both of them looked at each other at the same time. Sylvia's eyes had a rare look of confusion. Clearly, she had been badly shaken. Apart from the small wounds on her body from the previous battle, she did not lose any parts. Clearly, she had retreated in time before the explosive crystal arrived. Meddlesome woman. After pause for a while, Tang In pursed his lips under the mask. He squinted his long and narrow eyes and ignored her. He turned around and rushed into the passage at the entrance of the valley. Sylvia's body tensed up as she sensed the cold, killing intent in his eyes. She quickly regained her senses and waved her hand subconsciously. Buzz. The flaming spear that she had tossed away not far away quickly returned to her hand with a soft hum. She suddenly stood up and followed him into the valley. Although Sylvia didn't understand what was going on and didn't know who the other party was, the undisguised killing intent undoubtedly indicated that the other party didn't come with good intentions. The smoke in the narrow valley had yet to completely disperse, and everything was gray. As soon as Tangan rushed in, he stepped on a person. Well, to be more precise, he stepped on a disabled person who was missing all 4 limbs. Judging from the tattered gray cloth on the person's body, Tang In could tell that it was the Archmage from the Temple of Light who had entered the valley with Sessman. Looking around, Tang In once again saw a few figures lying on the ground. There were 3 great spellcasters from the temple, 2 black-robed men from the evil cult, and 2 Holy Knight commanders. Among them, except for the Holy Knight commander who had a broken leg and whose chest was still rising and falling slightly, everyone else was silent and motionless. He didn't need to take a closer look to know that they were most likely dead. Such a messy scene was enough to make anyone dumbfounded. It was also enough to shock the entire Bran Empire and the Divine Court of Light. In fact, logically speaking, the Thunder God's roar didn't have such power. Even if 2 more Thunder God's hammers were brought here, it was absolutely impossible to kill so many important people with one shot. The key point was that these masters had rushed into the valley with their backs to the back because they were in a hurry to escape. In addition, the soldiers who had operated the Thunder God's roar before were very skilled and aimed precisely at the valley's entrance. More importantly, the terrain here was too narrow. When the exploding crystal exploded here, the shock waves wreaked havoc back and forth a few times. The power of the exploding crystal was fully released, even to the point of exaggeration. All kinds of coincidences, all kinds of factors mixed together, finally formed this tragic scene. Of course, Tang didn't care about this. He only hated that the power wasn't strong enough because he didn't find Sessman's figure among them. He frowned slightly and continued to move forward. Dozens of meters away, Tang In saw a scorched earth pit that was still emitting smoke. Needless to say, this was the center of the explosion. Next to it, there were a few more charred corpses. After a quick identification, it should be a great magician of the Divine Hall and 3 evil cult masters. Bending down and fiddling with it, Tang In found some golden silk beside the great magician's corpse. Obviously, this wasn't Sessman either. His face darkened, just as he was about to curse, suddenly. Roar. A hoarse roar of extreme grief and anger came from behind him. Tang In was startled when he heard this, and immediately understood that it was Sylvia. Needless to say, she must have seen the tragic scene after entering the valley. He didn't dare to be negligent. A woman who had lost her mind was terrifying. This had nothing to do with strength, not to mention that this was indeed done by Tang In. He quickly got up and continued to run forward. The narrow valley was no more than 100 meters. Looking left and right, Tang In quickly reached the outside of the valley. Among them, he still didn't see Sessman's figure. Damn it, was there really nothing left of him after the explosion? Impossible. Quickly shaking his head, Tang In instantly denied this possibility. Although the power of Thunder God's roar was at its peak due to various reasons, if ordinary soldiers were here, there would be nothing left of them after the explosion. But now these people were all experts. With the support of battle energy armor, magic shields, and other defenses, they could still maintain their dignity. Damn, where exactly was he blown to? Out of the corner of his eyes, Tang In suddenly saw a red shadow. His body shook, and he suddenly turned his head. The periphery of the valley was a gentle hillside covered with sparse, thick trees. The red shadow was now hanging on a branch of a tree on the left side of the hill, fluttering in the wind. Taking a closer look, it was none other than Sessman in the red robe, who couldn't be found anywhere. "Aha!" Tang In exclaimed in ecstasy. He suddenly felt an immense sense of happiness. Damn it, he finally found this guy. Needless to say, Sylvia's push must have pushed Sessman away from the center of the explosion. Then, under the expansion of the blast, this guy was blown all the way here. Without hesitation, Tang In turned around and rushed in that direction. But after a few meters, his body suddenly paused, and he suddenly turned his head again. In his line of sight, at the bottom of the hill on the other side, densely packed Song Yin soldiers in standard armor suddenly appeared. It's the army of 10,000. Tang In instantly reacted. He remembered that Luke had mentioned the Song Yin army that was coming later. At this moment, Sylvia's sorrowful cry came from the direction of the valley entrance again, and this time, it was even closer. Not good. Tang In frowned and realized that the situation wasn't good. If he insisted on killing Sessman now, his escape route would be cut off by Sylvia and the army of 10,000. But could he let go of this rare opportunity? No. After a second's pause, Tang In sped up again and rushed in the direction of Sessman. Perhaps it was because of Xiao Weion's roar. Zeisman, who was lying on the tree branch, had already woken up. But although his eyes were open, it was obvious that he hadn't recovered from the situation in front of him. He looked around blankly. "Sessman, be careful." Sylvia's figure appeared at the entrance of the valley. She paused for a moment, and after seeing the situation in front of her, she immediately warned loudly. "Haha, too late." Bang. Sprinting here, Tang In kicked off the tree trunk and laughed loudly as he leaped onto the tree. Be careful of what?" Looking blankly at the entrance of the valley, Sessman's face was full of shock. When he turned around, a black shadow suddenly appeared in front of him. His face turned pale with fright. He subconsciously leaned back and was about to fall. He grabbed Sessman and steadied himself. "I'm telling you to be careful not to fall, sir." "Oh, thank you." Sessman sat down in a fluster and expressed his gratitude subconsciously. Then he raised his head and saw the obviously sneaky man in black. His body stiffened. Who are you? What do you want?" "Let me ask you a question." Tang In ignored Sessman's question. Instead, he grabbed the man's collar and asked in return, "Do you still remember Little Rock Village?" He flashed a dagger and pressed it against the man's throat. His tone was sincere. "Yes, time is of the essence. You only have one chance. Think carefully before you answer." Little Rock Village. Sessman was confused. Obviously, he didn't remember the small village in the south that had been destroyed by his hands. He only said in horror, "Don't kill me. You can't kill me. I'm from the Temple of Light." His magic shield had been destroyed by the shockwave of the explosion, and his opponent had closed in on him. His dagger was already at his throat. There was not much Zeisman could do at this moment. He could only keep talking about his noble status in hopes that his opponent would worry about him. But would Tang In worry? Of course not. He shook his head and interrupted with a sarcastic smile. "Oh, you really disappoint me. TSK, TSK. Of course, a person like you wouldn't care about the lives of a few hundred villagers." Pause for a while narrowed his long and narrow eyes. "I originally planned to kill you with an axe. Yes, an axe from Little Rock Village, but unfortunately I lost it. So, sorry, I can only use a dagger to send you on your way." As soon as he finished speaking, he lowered his hand. Spots of white light suddenly lit up on the branches. "You can't run away." Before he finished speaking, he stopped abruptly. Blood spurted out. Sessman, who was wearing a red robe, fell under the tree, and his head was in the hands of the expressionless Tang Yin. Tang Yin wasn't deliberately cruel. It was because the Temple of Light had endless healing spells. Only by cutting off the head could he be at ease. "No, damn it." Not far away, Sylvia, who was galloping over, roared. Her eyes were about to pop out of their sockets. In order to eliminate the cultists here, the team had gathered many masters from around the defense area. But now, there were only a few people left. They were almost completely wiped out. How could Sylvia not be mad? "Phew!" Tang Yin breathed out softly. He didn't seem to hear anything. He didn't feel much joy. Perhaps it was because he had been ecstatic before, but now he only felt a faint sense of comfort. He lowered his head and looked at the arm that Sessman had been holding tightly. He frowned slightly. There weren't any wounds, but the spots of white light that appear at the end and Sessman's unfinished words, "You can't run away," cast a shadow over Tang Yin's heart. He curled his lips. "That's why strange magicians are the most annoying." He raised his head and smiled. He suddenly swung his arm. "Huh, here you go." Sessman's head kept rolling in the air, dripping blood along the way. Intentionally or unintentionally, it fell behind Sylvia. Seeing this, Sylvia had no choice but to turn around and run to catch it. Beep! Tang Yin suddenly jumped up. He pursed his lips and let out a long whistle. The sound was so sharp that it pierced the clouds and shook the wilderness. Then, he raised his hands high and made a few gestures to the south. These gestures were for David and the others. Now that more than 10,000 soldiers were coming from the side, this place would be completely blocked. The only thing they could do now was to hurry up and escape and regroup with Fry. Roar! As soon as the whistle ended, another angry roar sounded. It was Sessman's head that Sylvia was about to catch. Suddenly, it emitted a bloody light and exploded with a bang. Red and white matter scattered on a large area, drenching Sylvia, who was caught off guard. Landing back on the ground, Tang Yin couldn't help but raise his head and laugh. He was extremely pleased. He had been holding back his frustration for the past few times. Now, he could finally vent some of his anger. "It's you? It's you." Perhaps the bloody light had left a deep impression on Sylvia. When she turned around and saw the unique dagger in Tang Yin's hand, she suddenly realized who it was and shouted in disbelief. "Of course it's me. Ha! I'm leaving. I'm leaving." Tang Yin didn't care that his identity was exposed because Sylvia didn't know who he was at all. After laughing, he turned around and ran away. Leaving? Pursing her lips, Sylvia raised her gun and chased after him. She flung her hair behind her back, and her slightly red eyes were full of killing intent. "You will die, no matter where you are. Another one who wants to follow me to the end of the world. Beauty, wake up. I'm really not that good. What do you like about me? I'll change, okay? Roar." Chapter 559. Boss. I. F asterisk CK. F asterisk CK. F asterisk CK. David and the rest were still slower than Twain, and by the time they rushed down the hill, the densely packed Song Yin soldiers had already blocked their way, forming an insurmountable chasm. They had no choice but to hide behind the bushes. Bang! David punched the ground and watched as Tang Yun and Sylvia ran further and further away. His face was pale. "Damn it, we were so F asterisk king close. It's that scary woman, Boss will be fine, right?" Luke shook his head and analyzed calmly. "Don't worry, with boss speed, he can definitely shake her off." Before he could finish his sentence, a furious roar came from afar. Roar! Everyone subconsciously raised their heads and saw that Xiao Weian, who was behind them, seemed to have been stimulated by something. Her entire body suddenly erupted with a dazzling milky white dough qi that gathered behind her back and instantly formed two white wings of light. As she flapped her wings, her galloping speed actually increased by a bit, even to the extent that she was faintly faster than Twain, who was in front of her. In the blink of an eye, two figures, one black and one white, disappeared into the hills. Gulp! Luke swallowed, and his mouth twitched. He said hesitantly, Don't worry. Boss will be fine. Didn't he escape from this woman a few times before? Everyone looked at each other and nodded in silence. They naturally believed in Tang and strength, but Tang had told them about Sylvia's skills and admitted that he was no match for her. Now that they had seen her in person, they were even more fearful of this terrifying woman who was like a prehistoric monster. To be honest, they didn't have much confidence in Tang Yin now. What do we do now? Do we just wait here? David clenched his fists and his face was extremely gloomy. It was also because they had experienced Sylvia's terror that they blamed themselves for not being able to successfully break through the blockade of the 10,000 soldiers. Because if they had help from the side, even if it was just a trap, Tang might have been able to escape. Our whereabouts have already been exposed. Not only are we courting death here, but we might also ruin things. Luke shook his head. Also, just now, the boss made a gesture for us to retreat and find Fry. He'll meet up with us when he has the chance. Right now, we can only believe in boss. This was the truth. They had really gone overboard this time. Not only did they blow up the Northern Wilderness experts, but they had also blown up more than 10 important people from the Temple of Light. Once this was exposed, not to mention them, even the Gray Coat Army might not be able to withstand it. Scratching his head fiercely, David looked at the densely packed soldiers in front of him, and then heard the sound of the search from behind. He stomped his foot, waved his hand, and said in a low voice, "Let's go retreat first." As soon as he finished speaking, he arched his back and led everyone to slowly retreat. At this time, there was a small disturbance below. Just as the soldiers were about to complete the encirclement of the valley entrance, two figures, one tall and one short, suddenly rushed out. Both of them were very strong, and ordinary soldiers were no match for them at all. However, they didn't linger. Before a large number of archers arrived, they hurriedly ran out of the encirclement. Seeing this, David and the others raised their eyebrows. They recognized that these were the two experts from the Northern Wilderness. But they didn't care. Taking advantage of the fact that the soldiers' attention was on the outside, they successfully sneaked out silently from the side. They didn't go far. For the time being, they weren't in a hurry to go back and meet up with Fry. Instead, they hid on the side and waited. They wanted to wait for the soldiers to completely leave before seeing if there was a chance to catch up with their boss and provide some help. But they didn't know that this wait was destined to be fruitless. At this time, large groups of blue flame soldiers were continuously advancing to the front line of the battlefield from the rear. Then, relying on a natural barrier in the blue flame army's defense zone, they formed a defensive wall made purely of soldiers. If one looked at the battle map, this defensive line happened to cut the crazy barbarian army into two. Of course, anyone with some military knowledge could tell that this defensive line wasn't stable. Although they had successfully stopped a portion of the barbarians and formed a situation where they had the advantage of numbers, the barbarians weren't the barbarians. However, the barbarians outside weren't just there for show. They wouldn't just sit and watch as their comrades were surrounded. Moreover, according to the comparison of the military power of both sides, this strategy of cutting off the barbarians at all costs could very well become a leaky strategy. This defensive line made purely of soldiers would also be smashed into pieces by the barbarians in a few days. It could be said that if there weren't any external factors, this strategy would be a terrible one. But the commander of the Blue Flame Army wasn't retarded. Or rather, even if the commander's brain suddenly short-circuited, the commanders of the Blue Flame Army wouldn't collectively become retarded. Of course, there was an external factor. It was the Zechen Legion that was rushing over at high speed. With the help of the famous Zechen Legion, there wouldn't be any problems with the outer defensive line. In fact, they would only push the barbarians back further. Regarding this, the entire Brand Empire's soldiers and even the civilians firmly believed in it. It was because of this confidence that the Ashen Flame Legion, who had been on the defensive all this while, would come out in full force. They would not hesitate to use their entire army and swear to fight against the barbarian army in the wild. Regarding the Blue Flame Army's sudden excitement, the barbarians were a little confused, but most of them were still excited. After all, compared to facing all kinds of weapons that gave them a headache during the siege, a battle in the wild was undoubtedly more exciting. The middle and low-ranking officers reported the situation to the Central Army and couldn't wait to pull out their men to fight the barbarians in the wild. However, what they didn't know was that the reports that flew to the Central Army like snowflakes didn't reach the commander in time. This was because Commander had already left the central camp and was rushing day and night. On the morning of the third day, when the Zechen Legion finally arrived at the Zechen Empire's defense area, a temporary army of 5,000 barbarians also arrived at the center of the Zechen Empire's defense area. As mentioned before, the Grand Border City was not only the closest city to the front line, but also the most important city in the Brand's 1,000-mile defensive line. As long as the barbarians broke through here, there would be a wide open space behind them. They could then ride their horses and charge into the northern part of the Brand without any hesitation. Right now, this 5,000 barbarian army was less than 60 miles away from the Grand Border City. Of course, there was still a long city wall and a medium-sized city in between them. This was one of the 4 military satellite cities of the Grand Border City. Its main responsibility was to form the first line of defense when the city was attacked and send information back to the rear to wait for reinforcements. 5,000 barbarians were silently waiting in a valley. From the simple animal skins and the dew on their long black fur, one could tell that they were tired and worn out. On one side of the valley was a rather tall hill. Standing here, through the faint morning mist, one could see the silhouette of a city that was more than 10 miles away. In fact, there was indeed someone standing here, silently watching them. His hair was slightly white, and he was wearing a big leaf dragon scale armor. His back was slightly hunched because of his age, but this didn't affect the majestic aura of a veteran who had been through hundreds of battles. This was the commander of the army, and Shuai, who had rushed here day and night. Logically speaking, after spending so much effort to get here, he wouldn't just stay here and watch the scenery. However, the reality was that after the army arrived, and Shuai suddenly ordered the soldiers to rest. Then, he stood here and watched for almost 10 minutes. And Shuai, we should go in. A middle-aged barbarian officer who had been within Shuai all year round hurriedly said. Phew, as if he had just woken up, and Shuai moved his body and let out a long breath. He shook his head and said, let's wait a little longer. We can't wait any longer, and Shuai. The middle-aged barbarian officer had an anxious expression on his face as he paced back and forth. We just received information that Tiu is only 20 miles away from the nearest city, with 8,000 men. There was also the deputy commander, who also led 8,000 men and rushed over. They were just 10 kilometers behind Tiwu. We won't make in time if we don't set out now. And Shuai's body shook when he heard this. The deep wrinkles on his old face trembled a few times. The fists hanging by his side tightened and loosened as if he was having a seizure. In the end, he let out a long sigh and said, let me think about it. What's there to think about? And Shuai waved his hand vigorously. The middle-aged barbarian officer was so anxious that he even went beyond the rules of his status. He stepped forward and said in a hurried tone, and Shuai, why have you been planning this for more than 10 years? Haven't you been waiting for this day? Now the opportunity has finally come. Who else is more qualified than you to enjoy this great honor? And Shuai's expression became more complicated as he was urged. He slowly raised his hand. His hand had always been as steady as a mountain, but now it was slightly trembling. He pinched the bridge of his nose, and his voice was also trembling. Alas, you don't understand. You don't understand. Chapter 560. On the morning mist hill, the middle-aged barbarian officer was still trying to persuade him. I don't understand. Of course I don't understand. I only know that this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Now, all you need is a simple order to attack, and you can shock the entire continent. Your name will go down in history. What's there to worry about? He suddenly paused, as if he had thought of something. Could it be that you're worried about TU's identity? So what if he's the first prince? You were the one who came up with this plan. You've been working on it day and night. You've been cautious and careful. You've been working hard for more than 10 years, and now you're finally here. Naturally, you should be the one to enjoy this glory. I don't think even the Empress would say anything about this. He waved his hand, stopping the middle-aged officer from trying to persuade him. It's not that. And Shuai clenched his fists and hammered his forehead. He raised his head and sighed, shaking his head. Actually, I'm a little scared. The middle-aged officer couldn't help but be startled when he heard this. He turned his head stiffly and stared blankly at this old general who had calmly faced countless battles on the battlefield and was able to quietly devise strategies to win battles thousands of miles away. He muttered in disbelief, "Scared? Yes." And Shuai nodded slightly. He was magnanimous and directly admitted to his cowardly actions. He looked at the outline of the city in the faint fog in the distance, and a self-mocking and bitter smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Perhaps I am really old. The older I am, the more cowardly I become. Even though I know that there are no flaws in this plan that took more than 10 years to weave together, that the city in front of me has been seized, that the spies that I planted have not been exposed, and that ZE has not made any targeted movements, I am still very confident that I am still alive. Everything is so logical, so interlinked. He paused and held his forehead, looking even older. But I'm still scared. I'm scared that this is a trap that Z lured me into. The middle-aged officer frowned. But whether it's the information we gathered or the information from spies, Z doesn't know anything about this. He really doesn't know about this. The gates of the Grand Border City are also open for us. And Shuai waved his hand and nodded. I know that everything is fine. But Sai, at this point, he had reached a dead end. Let's not talk about how the impregnable Grand Border Fortress had become a piece of meat in their mouths. Right now, this and Shuai was clearly afraid and unwilling to eat this piece of meat. Thus, any kind of persuasion would be useless. Letting out a long sigh, the middle-aged officer knew that it was impossible. He suppressed his disappointment and asked, "Then what should we do now?" In order to get here in the shortest time possible, we didn't give any orders. Now, tens of thousands of our warriors are surrounded by Tsang Yan's defense zone. It's all right. And Shuai took a deep breath, and the wrinkles on his old face gradually eased. He said calmly and firmly, as long as we can kill Z, not to mention tens of thousands of warriors, even if it's 10 times, 100 times more, well, it's still worth it. The middle-aged officer opened his mouth, but in the end, he lowered his head in silence. Those who weren't from a northern wilderness would never understand the pressure that Z gave them. It was as if they were carrying tens of thousands of mountains on their backs, and it was impossible for them to raise their heads. So, what we need to do now is to get to the front of Z's route and set up a trap for him. After saying this, and Shuai took a deep look at the fortress in front of him. The corners of his eyes twitched a few times, and he turned around and walked down the hill. That's right. Since I'm going to pass on my order, tell the deputy commander to immediately lead the troops back to the Thunder City defense zone. Glory has always been first come, first serve. Since we're late, there's no need to join in the fun. As for, in the end, this is the world of the young. As long as he's lucky, this great reputation will be given to him. Also, I really want to see what expression Z will have when he finds out that TU destroyed the fortress that he worked so hard to build for nearly 20 years. Whether he was willing or unwilling. The 5,000 barbarian army that had hurried overstayed about 10 miles away from the fortress for about 15 minutes, and finally retreated the same way they came. 10 minutes later, another group of 8,000 barbarians finally arrived outside the other satellite city. They were also travel-worn and weary. Wow! Tu looked up and let out an exaggerated exclamation as he looked at the tall and thick fortress wall in front of him. Haha, I can see it. I can finally see it. You know, I've dreamed of this scene countless times since I was young. Yuan Fong didn't pay attention to this boring exclamation. Instead, he looked at the top of the wall with a nervous expression. They had already entered the attack range. If the Mjolnir, large ballistae, and other heavy weapons placed on the top of the wall were to shoot, their mere 8,000 barbarians wouldn't be able to withstand it. Don't worry, uncle. Compared to the nervous Yuan Fong, Tu was much more relaxed. He rode his wolf at the front and pointed at the top of the wall. Hey, do you see that? Those soldiers have already seen us, but did they do anything? This was indeed the case. Whether it was the tall watchtower or the soldiers standing guard on the top of the wall, they didn't seem to see the 8,000 barbarians. They stood motionless like statues. Yuan Fong finally felt relieved when he saw this. Then, an indescribable feeling of excitement welled up in his chest. His whole body felt as light as a feather, as if he was sitting on the clouds. This was the heavenly moat city that the tribe couldn't conquer even after decades of fighting. Even the grand border city, which was personally guarded by Zi, was waiting for them to conquer. Oh, the great god of the wilderness! If this is a dream, please don't let me wake up. Creak, creak. When Tu and the others were only 2 or 3 miles away from the fortress wall, a series of muffled sounds were heard. Then, the 2 iron gates in the opposite direction slowly opened. It was as if a dusty history book had been opened. It was full of a heavy feeling. It's open, it's open. Quick, quick, speed up. Tu and Yuan Fong were overjoyed when they saw this. They continuously waved their hands and ordered the panting barbarian soldiers behind them to speed up. In fact, they didn't need to give any orders. The excited barbarians behind them moved their legs crazily, as if they had seen a naked woman. They moved forward at high speed. Hua! Beside the gate, there were dozens of soldiers wearing Zichen's standard armor. After the gate was pushed open, they stood at the side with a stupefied expression. It was as if they didn't see the barbarians in front of them. Tu was the first to pass through the gate. He took a deep breath as if he wanted to savor the unique smell of the Zichen's defense zone. Then, he saw a brand officer on a war horse waiting at the side. The two looked at each other. The officer didn't say anything. He only made a follow-me gesture. Then, he pulled the reins and urged the horse to rush forward. Quick, continue to move forward. Tu didn't make any move to occupy the city immediately. He still waved his hand and ordered his soldiers to follow the figure in front of them. They crossed the medium-sized satellite city. In the early morning, most of the citizens were still in a sweet dream. There was basically no one on the wide road under the light fog. Of course, there were still some people who were missing. Some of them were drunkards who had just woken up from a hangover. Some of them were women who had to get up early to prepare breakfast. They were awake and became the first batch of witnesses to this strange situation. What was this? These few witnesses were stunned on the side of the street. They couldn't react in time. Although there was only a wall between here and the front line, they hadn't seen the barbarians for more than 10 years. Those painful memories had already faded away. After a while, barbarians. They finally found this strange code name from their dusty memories. The second reaction of all the witnesses was to rub their eyes. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Some drunkards even laid down on the side of the street again. They closed their eyes and murmured, "I drank too much. I drank too much." Finally, a few hysterical screams broke the silence of the morning and resounded throughout the city. Tu subconsciously turned his head and raised his eyebrows. He didn't show any surprise. Originally, even if they had spies, it was impossible for everyone in the city to be spies. Moreover, they had already entered the city. As long as they maintained this speed, no one would be able to spread the news to the grand border city first. Quick, quick, quick! Go faster! The closer they got to their target, the more restless Ti Wu, who was sitting on the giant wolf, became. First, he roared a few more times, then he counted with his fingers and muttered in a low voice, "That old man is still behind me. It's impossible for him to arrive before me. that could be eliminated. That old man in Shuai. Damn, that old fox must have left before me. I just don't know how far he is from here. Could it be that he's already ahead of me? No. Can't you give the young people a chance to live? Hugging his head with both hands, Tiu's face was distorted. At this moment, he seemed a little crazed. However, before the frowning Yuan Fong could reach out to comfort him, he suddenly raised his head and clasped his hands together. His expression was very sincere. Great wilderness God, oh, and light God, you must bless me to reach the grand border city first. Also, let that old man in Shuai eat something bad and have diarrhea until he loses all strength. Please, please. Yuan Fong's arms froze. The corner of his mouth twitched and his body trembled. After a long while, he turned his head away and was speechless. Following the brand officer in front of them, the 8,000 barbarians quickly passed through the city. At this time, the southern city gate was already open. The troops didn't stop at all and directly passed through, following which, they continued to run along the smooth road. After passing through the satellite city, the city in front of them naturally went without saying the grand border city. The sun had yet to rise in the east, and a light morning fog covered the surroundings. Everything seemed so peaceful, calm, and normal. However, no one knew that on this normal morning, the Zicheng Defense District that had been peaceful for decades would welcome a group of murderous, uninvited guests. Alas, Kalos City was in the Thunderbolts Army's defensive zone. Although the barbarians hadn't taken over the city, it hadn't been peaceful either. A month ago, I met little Sa in the city behind us. When I learned that his destination was still Kalos City, I advised him not to take that dangerous trade route again. But what did he say? He said that the more dangerous the place, the higher the value of the goods. He refused to listen to me. In the end, a week ago, I received news from my fellow timber merchants that they had bumped into a barbarian team that had infiltrated the defensive line. There were more than a dozen people in the caravan, but not a single one of them survived. Sigh. Hearing this, the two middle-aged men sighed. They were both small merchants and didn't have the capital to hire martial artists. They traveled all over the world and relied on their courage to earn some hard-earned money. Naturally, they would feel sad for the loss of their companions. Wealth comes from danger. What a pity. He was such a great lad. They shook their heads. Sigh, at my age, all I can do is to live a stable life and earn some money. Yes, this incident touched me too much. That's why I came to this trade route. All right, when I just arrived, I heard that the Zicheng Legion was also making a move. Could it be? I'll do, don't worry. Where are we? The Grand Border City. As long as we show the name of Z, the military god, we'll see if those barbarians dare to take a step forward. Before he finished speaking, a loud noise came from the city gate in front of them. Because it was too noisy, other than the words "close the gate" and "barbarians," they couldn't hear anything else. Before the two men could understand what was going on, there were all sorts of terrified screams. The crowd suddenly turned around like a tide. Horses neighed, and goods were overturned. It was a chaotic scene. Sai, be careful. My goods, my goods. What's going on? Help. In what seemed like an instant, the orderly city gate suddenly exploded into a pot of chaos. Most of the people did not know what was going on. They were pushed back involuntarily, and panic began to spread. The merchants didn't even have time to care about their goods. When they turned around, they saw the neatly arranged carriages shake and topple over on the ground, smashing into the people around them. A woman who had been forcefully pushed against the wall on the side of the street turned around. Her face was covered in blood as she cried out that her child was missing. She rushed into the crowd and was immediately knocked down by various forces. She disappeared in an instant. There were people everywhere. There were terrified faces everywhere. There were screams, moans, and cries for help. At the city gate, the source of the chaos. Ha! Grand Border City. Grand Border City. Grand Border City. I was the King first to come in. Two stood at the entrance of the city gate and laughed crazily. On his left and right 5,000 barbarians rushed in like a flood. Their blood-red eyes stared at the panicked people around them. They were the first group of barbarians from the northern wilderness. Regardless of how they did it, as long as they stood here, they were heroes who achieved the dream of the northern wilderness tribes. Their names were enough to leave their names in history. Tiu, we should quickly take over Zichen's headquarters. Yuan Fong was also ecstatic. However, he still had a trace of rationality and shouted out the first target to attack. Right. I almost forgot about that. Tiu finally came back to his senses and nodded. He pointed his finger and said, "You take people to the east side of the city. You take people to the west side of the city. All of you spread out and close all 4 city gates. The rest of you follow me." The barbarians who couldn't hold themselves back roared and rushed in all directions. There were also about 1,000 barbarians who stayed behind. Some of them pushed the heavy city gates and slowly closed them. The rest of them rushed up the stairs to the top of the city wall. There was a small-scale chaos there. The soldiers who were also wearing Zichen's armor were killing each other. Di Wu and Yuan Fong rode on their wolves, leading over 1,000 barbarians along the main road towards the center of the city. The chaos before was only at the city gate. The rest of the city didn't know about it. When the passers-by saw the group of barbarians, they were stunned. After a few decades of peaceful life, the citizens of the grand border city no longer had any sense of danger. The barbarians weren't kind people. When they saw the brand blocking their way, they waved their metal rods and smashed them. Bang, bang, bang. Men, women, the elderly, children, everyone stared blankly at the giant metal rods falling from the sky. In an instant, the sound of watermelons being smashed could be heard. Red, white, gray, all kinds of liquids were splattered along the way. At this moment, the citizens finally came back to their senses. Screams and screams could be heard again as they hurriedly ran in all directions. Similar situations played out in the other cities. In front of these bloodthirsty barbarians, rich and powerful merchants, famous scholars, noble and elegant ladies, all of them were smashed into pieces with a single strike of the iron club. Chaos spread, blood spread, and the souls of the dead spread. When Tu and the rest killed their way to the center of the city and arrived at the Zichen Legion's headquarters, they found that there were already 2 groups of people fighting at the gate. They were all soldiers of the Zichen Legion. The only difference was that the soldiers outside the gate had a red cloth on their right arm, while the soldiers inside didn't. Inside the gate, a burly man waved his sword and roared, F*CKU, Gao Dessen, F*CKU, you dare to collude with the barbarians and betray the brand. Say something, F*King, look at me. F*King, look at me if you have the guts. He lowered his head and muttered. Sorry, I'm following orders. I'm following your F*King orders. Grinning, Tiu waved his hand and said, kill your way in. There weren't many brand soldiers in the city. He didn't know if they had been transferred away earlier or if there were other reasons. Until now, there hadn't been any obstructions. Most of the soldiers blocking the door were also standing guard. Naturally, there weren't many guards. If it wasn't for the fact that most of the attacking Zichen soldiers had their heads lowered and didn't dare to look into the eyes of the barbarians, this place would have been taken down a long time ago. But now that the barbarians had stepped forward to replace them, the guards naturally couldn't stop them. Seeing that the gate was about to be taken down, Tiu and Yuan Fong suddenly raised their heads and saw a wisp of smoke rising quickly. Before they could react, it quickly turned into rolling smoke. Damn it! Looking at each other, Tiu and Yuan Fong had a bad feeling in their hearts. They roared, quick, kill your way in. Roar. Boom! The attacking barbarians roared in unison and pushed down the gate along with the brand soldiers behind it. Tiu pointed at the brand officer who was standing at the side and said anxiously, quick, lead the way to Z's house. After a while, Tiu walked out of the gate with a gloomy face. His eyes were flashing with coldness. Z's house was burned down, along with the 2 houses beside it that contained all kinds of information. As for the person who set the fire, it was said that he was just an old gatekeeper. Mother of *Few. Tu took a deep breath and looked at the chaotic grand border fortress. He licked his lips and laughed crazily. "Ha, good, good, good." He suddenly roared, "Pass down my orders. Seal all 4 gates and kill everyone. Rob and burn. I want this grand border fortress to be turned into ruins in the shortest time possible. Graves, Firefield, rejoice. This is the hunting ranch that we have always dreamed of." Chapter 562. Speed was the most important thing in war, not to mention a surprise attack. Ever since Tu led the 8,000 barbarians into the satellite city, he didn't plan to hide his tracks and advanced at high speed. After entering the grand border city, he went even crazier. As such, this news naturally couldn't be hidden. Only half a day had passed. The grand border city had fallen. The barbarians had massacred everyone in the city. The city was on fire, and smoke was billowing. All sorts of shocking news spread out. The first to receive the news was the commander of the barbarians, and Shuai. This was inevitable. Even though he had retreated at the last moment, he was still the closest to the grand border city. Moreover, he had been paying attention to the situation in this direction, so he naturally knew what Tiwu was doing in the grand border city. Looking in the direction of the grand border city, and Shuai's expression was a little complicated. Regret, excitement, pity, all sorts of emotions mixed together, and he was stunned. It wasn't that he wasn't able to replace Wang Zhong, even though this was the result of his hard work for over a decade, and Tiu was just a despicable person who stole the fruit. What made him feel regretful was that this fruit was too big, too big. Zi and the Zichen Legion had suppressed the northern wilderness for over a decade, causing the barbarians to be unable to raise their heads. When this news spread out, the 100,000 mountains on the backs of the barbarians and the bone-eroding needles in their hearts disappeared by more than half. It could be said that Tiu had stepped on Zi to get to where he was today. His reputation was enough to shake the entire continent, and he would leave a mark in the annals of history. However, no matter what, this fruit was something that Shuai was worried about, and he intentionally gave it away. With his magnanimity, once he made up his mind, he wouldn't regret it so much. Furthermore, he was currently leading the army to prepare for an ambush. If he could successfully kill Zi, the glory wouldn't be any less than the former. He only disapproved of Tiu's actions and felt that it was a pity that the city Zi had built for over a decade was destroyed. It wasn't that he was soft-hearted. With the bad relationship between the northern wilderness and the Bran, even if more Bran people died, he wouldn't raise his eyebrows. It was just that this veteran who had been through hundreds of battles had a broader vision and thought further into the future. If they could take down the undamaged grand border fortress and use it as an important strategic springboard to attack Boran's hinterland, it would undoubtedly be more advantageous. Of course, and Shuai's disapproving and pity, because he could understand why Tiu's actions. After all, Tiwu was not him. His control over his subordinates had not reached the level where they would follow his orders. Ze and the Purple Star Army were putting too much pressure on the Northern Baron territory. Now that there was a chance to destroy their base, the barbarian warriors would not let it go. With such emotions piling up, it didn't matter if Tiwu wanted to massacre the city or not. It was imperative. In the end, it was destroyed. The old barbarian general sighed emotionally. He had observed the grand border city hundreds of times, and his voice was a little dry. Zi's frontline era is over. Sanyan Army, headquarters. When the news reached here, it was already close to dusk. This was after the scout desperately whipped a few horses to death to reach here in such a short time. Even so, after roaring out 2 sentences, the dedicated scout fainted on the spot. The grand border city has fallen, and the barbarians have massacred the city. The room instantly fell into silence. The old general, who was holding a cup of tea, and the officers who were having a heated discussion, all stood there like statues. They stared blankly at the scout who had fallen to the ground. It was as if they were looking at a lunatic on the side of the road. The grand border city has fallen. Are you King kidding me? Although the 3 armies had been playing tricks in the dark, none of them were willing to give in to each other. However, the Tsangyan army and the Thunderbolts army knew that although the Zichen Legion didn't have any great achievements in the past few years, and the military god Z didn't even take a step out of the Grand Border City, this didn't mean that the Zichen Legion, which was known as the strongest legion in the brand, didn't know how to fight. Originally, the barbarians didn't even attack the Zichen defense region. So how could they do anything? In fact, although it was only a short day, the reports that came to the headquarters were like snowflakes. They said that the Zichen Legion had successfully stopped the barbarians outside the walls of the Tsangyan army. Without a doubt, this showed that the title of the strongest legion wasn't undeserved. Putting down the cup of tea, the Tsangyan army's general had a serious expression. He said in a deep voice, "Pass down the order, send a team to the Zichen defense region to scout the situation. If you see any scouts coming from there, bring them to me immediately." A yes. An officer quickly pushed open the door and left. The officers in the room slowly regained their senses. They looked at each other with disbelief and unease on their faces. To be honest, they had serious doubts about the authenticity of this news. The Grand Border City that hadn't seen a war in the past 20 years had fallen. This was really a test of their ability to accept this news. However, logically speaking, even if this unconscious scout ate the guts of a leopard, he wouldn't dare to pass on such a ridiculous piece of fake news. Thinking up to here, a few high-ranking officers went forward to help the unconscious scout up. They shook him a few times, but didn't see any effect. They brought tea from behind and directly sprayed it on the scout's face, but he still didn't wake up. Seeing this, the hearts of the officers couldn't help but sink. They weren't the type of people who only knew how to talk on paper. They were the type of people who could lead their troops in a battle. This scout didn't wake up no matter what they did. This could only mean that his physical and mental strength were completely exhausted. From a certain point of view, the news that this scout tried his best to pass on shouldn't be a joke. Some of the more cautious officers began to accept this fact with difficulty. They also subconsciously considered the direct impact of this news. However, after thinking about it a few times, their scalps were already numb. A chill ran down their spines, and their bodies felt as if they had fallen into an ice cellar. The Grand Border City's strategic position was extremely sensitive. If they broke through here, there would be flat terrain behind them. There was almost no place to defend. As long as the barbarians used this as a strategic springboard and continuously gathered more people, they would be able to enter the hinterland of the north and attack as they pleased. If they retreated, they would be able to defend the city. They would be in an impregnable position. In the past, before the Zichen Legion entered the Grand Border City, the city had indeed been destroyed many times. Every time, the brand had to pay a huge price. Sometimes, they even sacrificed other battle lines and suffered heavy losses before they could retake the city. However, in this battle, the northern wilderness had brought all the forces of the tribes to attack. It was hard to say if they could retake the city again. Moreover, even if they didn't consider the future, they only considered the present. If the news of the fall of the Grand Border City was true, how would the Zichen Legion, who was reinforcing their defense zone, react? Would Z transfer all the troops in order to retake the Grand Border City? If Z really did that, then the Blue Flame Legion would undoubtedly become the biggest victim. One had to know that the tens of thousands of barbarians that they forcefully encircled hadn't been fully digested. Once the Zichen Legion retreated, their defense line would definitely be attacked by the barbarians. The result was obvious. They would definitely be beaten to a pulp. At that time, the Blue Flame Legion's defense zone would be completely lost. As these terrifying thoughts flashed through his mind, the door of the headquarters was pushed open again. The officer who had just left walked in with a few dusty scouts. The fall of the Grand Border City was an important piece of news. Naturally, more than one scout would know about it. It was just a matter of time before the news was spread. It was obvious that this officer had just left not long ago when he met these three scouts. Lowering his head to avoid the burning gazes around him, the officer said in a pained tone, "Marshal, the Grand Border City has indeed fallen." Hua. Although they had already received the news earlier and had seen the officer's mournful expression when he came in, they still couldn't help but cry out in surprise and gasp when the news was confirmed. At this moment, bang! A thunder-like sound rang out. The table trembled, and the teacup fell to the ground, making a sharp, shattering sound. The room instantly fell silent. "What are you panicking for? The sky won't fall." Slowly retracting his hand, the Blue Flame Legion's general's face became serious. He then looked around and took a deep breath. Where is Z right now? He should be in the middle of Zichen's army. Should be. The officer who replied looked straight into the Blue Flame Legion's furious eyes and shrugged. Other than asking us about the situation, he didn't send us any news. According to the information we received, the soldiers only saw the other 4 Zichen's armies. They didn't see Z at all. The Blue Flame Legion's general was surprised. He then frowned and fell into deep thought. After a while, he said in a deep voice, "Pass down the order. Send someone to spread the news to all the Zichen's armies." "General," the officers exclaimed at the same time. They then looked at each other and wanted to say something, but didn't. "Get rid of your stupid thoughts." As if he knew what they were thinking, the Blue Flame Legion's general's face darkened. They are Brand's generals. They know what to do. When the officers heard this, they lowered their heads and remained silent. It was obvious that they were worried that the Zichen Legion's armies would suddenly retreat and bring disaster to this place. Therefore, they wanted to keep the news a secret. After calming down a little, the Blue Flame Legion's eyes flashed, and he muttered, "Also, try to keep this news a secret. And at least don't let it spread in our defense area." The officers were stunned. The fall of the Grand Border City was such a big matter that it was impossible to keep it a secret. However, the Blue Flame Legion's general was doing this on purpose. Could it be that there was still a chance? That was impossible. If Z really had the ability to turn the situation around, or if this was just a scheme, how could they let the Grand Border City fall into the enemy's hands? How could they let thousands of civilians die under the barbarians' blade? There used to be a small checkpoint of the Ashen Flame Army here, but it had been taken over by the barbarians a few months ago. Of course, after occupying this checkpoint, the barbarians didn't go any further into Zichen's defensive zone. Over time, people gradually forgot about this place. The barbarians here didn't have any military missions other than scouting the movements of the Zichen Legion, so they were quite relaxed. However, the barbarians who had gathered at the top of the wall of the checkpoint were looking at the black mass of people who had appeared out of nowhere. Their bodies tensed up, and they became somewhat nervous. Because of the dark sky and the fact that they were all wearing black armor, the barbarians who were looking down from above couldn't tell who these people were. However, when they saw that the other party was constantly setting up something a few miles away and the occasional reflection of blade lights, they were sensitive enough to smell the scent of danger and hurriedly took precautions. A few miles away, Laer Fu looked around at his busy surroundings. His expressionless face was still paralyzed, but his eyes revealed a hint of confusion and confusion. There were many things that he was confused about, but no one explained it to him. Laer Fu was confused because he felt that his presence here was a little unnecessary. Yes, it was unnecessary. Ever since he and Z had led the 9th Army out of the Grand Border City, Z's body had been deteriorating at a speed visible to the naked eye. Other than when she was riding on a horse, she spent the rest of her time in the tent and never showed herself. Laer Fu had expected this situation. Just like what Z had said before they left, he needed to help command the troops. Laer Fu was also prepared to take on this heavy responsibility, but along the way, he didn't need to give any orders, and no one came to report to him. These cold and emotionless soldiers of the 9th Army acted as if they had never seen him before. Furthermore, it was not only him. According to Laer's observation, these soldiers had never asked or reported anything to Z. Everything was done on their own, including changing their route without permission and attacking the small checkpoint in front of them. Are they still soldiers? Laer Fu frowned and walked in front of a young man who was waving his hand. He looked like an officer. Yes, he looked like an officer. The 20,000 soldiers of the 9th Army were all wearing black armor. There was no way to tell the difference between an officer and a soldier. The young man raised his head and both of them looked at each other. After a while, there was no salute or conversation. If Laer Fu, who had the nickname Silent Eagle, was expressionless and looked calm, then his aura could barely be considered calm. Then all the soldiers of the Ninth Army only had one face, cold and empty. They ignored everything in front of them, including themselves. What are you all doing? After a few days of interaction, Laer Fu knew that if he wanted to continue the conversation, he had to be the one to speak first. Luckily, he was just cold and not mute. The young man quickly replied with a hoarse voice that seemed like he hadn't spoken for a long time. Attack. It was simple, but it was no doubt nonsense. Laer Fu's expression didn't change as he continued to ask, who gave the order to attack? Marshal. Who changed the route? Marshal. Laer Fu frowned and asked, when? 3 days ago. 3 days ago, that was when they set off. Laer Fu nodded. If this was decided by Z, then there wouldn't be a problem. He thought for a while and asked again why. I don't know. Although the young officer's words were simple, he gave a clear answer to every question. Now that he said he didn't know, there was a sense of conviction. Laer Fu nodded and didn't continue to ask. He pointed at the things that the soldiers were playing with and asked, what is this? A weapon? This was one of Laer Fu's doubts. He had been in the army for decades and had experienced countless battles. However, he had never seen a weapon that was about half the height of a person. There was a metal pipe that could be adjusted, and there was a square black box at the bottom of the pipe. From its appearance, it looked a bit like Mjolnir, Thunder Roar, or something like that. However, its size was too small. A horse or a few people could easily carry it. If this was the latest alchemy weapon, how could Relf, as a general, not know about it? Also, the cannon was so small. Even if it could be fired, how far could it hit? 100 meters. The young officer's face was still cold. I don't know, yes. Laer Fu raised his eyebrows and instantly understood. I don't know was an answer to the question of what it was, and yes, was to confirm that this strange-looking thing was a weapon. The answer was clear, but now that they had used this weapon and were very familiar with it, how could they not know? The young officer seemed to have sensed Laer Fu's anger and added, it hasn't been named yet. Oh, Laer Fu was surprised. It was indeed a new weapon, but why hadn't he heard of it before? The exchange between the two sides ended here, and the young officer had no intention of asking Relf about how to fight the next battle. Now that Laer Fu had finished his questioning, he could only go and ask Ze about the rest of the questions. They were both people of few words, so they didn't have to make any small talk. Laer Fu pondered for a while and walked towards the central tent. The young officer turned around and continued to command the soldiers around him. The so-called central tent was only 2 feet in size. It was a small tent with fur and warm animal skin hanging outside. Other than Z and Laer Fu, no one else entered. Naturally, there were no officers gathered to discuss the battle. Z was sitting cross-legged on the carpet with a quill in his mouth. He coughed from time to time and looked at the few pieces of white paper in front of him. Marshal. Laer Fu came in and greeted him. He walked straight over. He casually swept his gaze over the area and narrowed his eyes slightly. He couldn't help but stop in his tracks. It turned out that the few pieces of white paper were the drawings of the strange weapons he saw just now. However, the drawings on the paper were much more complicated. There were many parts mixed together, and it was dazzling. Oh, Laer Fu, you came just in time. Z raised his head, and his eyes lit up. His pale face was devoid of blood. He waved his hand excitedly and said, Hee, I was just thinking, what should I name this thing? Name? Laer Fu was stunned when he heard this. He thought about the meaning behind this sentence, and his expressionless face was filled with shock. Ha, that's right. I researched it myself. Of course I have to name it. Z smiled and gestured for Laer Fu to sit in front of him. Are you surprised? I spent a total of 8 years on this, and I did it behind your back. And there's still some flaws, but it can still be used. As for its power, wait, you should be able to see it later. Laer Fu nodded. Even though he had many doubts, he still asked the biggest question in his mind. Where are we going? Laer Fu's arm froze. Oh, you finally got the answer? Shrugging her shoulders, Eve took away the pieces of paper and looked around. Then, she picked out a topographic map from the messy papers around her. She drew a circle on a certain spot with her quill. She raised her head and sighed. Here, after so many years, it's time to go see your old superior, my old friend, Sir Anglos. At that moment, the tent was silent. The dim light of dusk seeped in, and the two faces were blurry. An indescribable atmosphere slowly spread. Chapter 564. Author's note. The content was combined into one chapter. Well, this chapter needs to connect many details, so it's more difficult to write. Then, please recommend me. Carrot, Anglos, this surname had a hint of the north, and not many people knew this name. But if he changed his name, for example, Marshallin, he was the highest commander of the Northern Wilderness Army, then many people would know. After a moment of silence, Ralph's tense body slowly relaxed. He sighed softly, looked down, and said, Marshall knew long ago. Not really long ago. You have been in the Zechen Legion for 18 years. You went from a normal soldier to a general today. I only confirmed it 13 years ago. At that time, I had just started preparing for the Ninth Army. Raising her head slightly, Z's expression was somewhat dispirited. She did not take any defensive actions. Actually, if you were just a spy and quietly collected information, I might not have been able to discover your true identity. But Anglos was too greedy. Cough, maybe he had no choice. He coughed a few times, shook his head, and said calmly, the Northern Wilderness has changed a lot over the years, especially in the military. But the environment and climate are there, and food is always a big problem. There will be times when the prey can't be caught, and soldiers need to eat and fight. More than 10 years ago, you received Anglo's order to interfere in the smuggling. You used your identity to quickly open up the smuggling route to the north and south and transported countless resources to the Northern Wilderness. You became the mysterious person in the eyes of the smuggling nobles. Although you did it secretly, and your protection was flawless, the brand did not suspect you even after several large-scale investigations. But this matter is complicated, and there are flaws to be found. I see. Laer nodded in realization. Bowing slightly, he said, Thank you. Thank you for telling me, Marshal, so I won't die in a daze. You're welcome. Z's expression was calm. He did not look happy that he found the spy. Instead, he looked a little regretful. It's been more than 10 years, you and I. There's still time. There's no rush to bite that poisonous tooth in your mouth. Don't you want to clarify all the doubts in your heart? Ralph suddenly loosened his clenched teeth. His body shook as he looked at Z.E. in a daze. Then, a self-mocking smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. It turns out that the Marshal also knows about this. It seems that I have failed as a spy. Something's not right. Shaking his head lightly, Z's expression turned solemn. In the entire history of the West Swamp continent, there is no spy more successful than you. Deciding on a problem requires wisdom, but implementing it requires patience. No matter what it was, no one dared to call it failure after doing it quietly for more than 10 years. What's more, he had poisonous fangs in his mouth for more than 10 years. During this period, they were not allowed to drink alcohol, chew food quickly, speak continuously, and even their facial expressions were not allowed to be intense. Silent eagle, cough. I'm not as good as you. Laer Fu was silent when he heard this. The corners of his mouth moved slightly, and he pulled out an extremely small smile, as if he had agreed to this praise. Of course, other than him, no one else in this world could understand the feeling of living with poisonous fangs in his mouth for more than 10 years. This compliment was indeed deserved. After coughing a few times, Z covered his mouth and nose as he got up. He walked a few steps to the curtain and turned his head. Let's go. Accompany me for one last time. If you have any questions, feel free to ask me. After he finished speaking, he opened the curtain and walked out first. Ralph did not object. He got up silently and picked up the purple fur cloak beside him. He quietly followed behind Z, just like he had done for more than 10 years. The endless dusk gradually descended. The dark surroundings were not much brighter than the tent. The cold wind blew past. Z's body slightly tensed up as he let out a long breath of cold air. Ralph walked up a few steps and put the cloak on Z. Then he walked half a step behind and silently walked to the side. Not far away, the soldiers of the 9 armies were still setting up. It seemed like they were almost done. Some of the soldiers coldly took out their blades and prepared to attack. However, at this time, no one came to ask about the battle strategy. All these years, I know that you have been trying to find out about the situation of the 9 armies. You think that this is my trump card. Z. He narrowed his eyes as he looked at the soldiers of the 9 armies, not far away. He tightened the collar of his cloak and said, "Actually, the so-called 9 armies is just a simple experiment of mine. And you know that ever since I entered the Grand Border City, I have been very free. More than 10 years ago, I gathered many elite soldiers and dochi experts in one place. I wanted to combine them and form a special team with a small number of people, but with key destructive power." He smacked his lips. In the end, TSK, of course it failed. Those soldiers who were smart or strong in the original team were put together. Not only did they not stack up, but they also paled in comparison. After trying a few times, this idea still failed in the end. At that time, I was wondering if my train of thought was wrong, and I walked into a dead end. That shouldn't be the case. Maybe I was just not smart enough. Because not long ago, I saw someone successfully perfect this idea. The battle strength of the team was as strong as I expected. It was an unbelievable feat. He held his forehead. Oh, I was wrong. After that failure, I changed my mindset. I don't want complicated ideas. I just want to be close to the war itself. The simpler the better. And war is ultimately a battle between humans. Schemes and other things are just ancillary. Humans are also the most complicated. Just like those dochi masters, they are very strong and can fight against 10 people alone. However, they are proud of their abilities and can cooperate well with their comrades. As for those who were smart, they knew the importance of teamwork and were flexible in their thinking. If they were placed in an army alone, their intelligence and wisdom would often lead the army to victory. However, when the situation is bad, their thoughts are more complicated than normal soldiers. They don't think about cutting off all means of retreat. Instead, they think about other ways to avoid danger. You all know what happened after that. I took in orphans, homeless people, etc. They had nothing to worry about, and their thoughts were simple. As long as they had food to eat and clothes to protect themselves from the cold, they would do anything. I could give them all of this, including the dochi cultivation method. What they needed to do was to train according to my plan. After more than 10 years, they became the 9th army in front of us. And this was their first real battle. As for the result, we will know soon. Lei Erfu's expression changed slightly. He looked at the cold soldiers in front of him and couldn't help but nod. He finally understood why they were like this. When a person was trained to the point that they didn't even care about their own life, who would dare to fight against them? Okay. Now, it's time for you to ask the question in your heart. Z turned around and laughed. Lei Erfu nodded and thought for a while. Then, he raised his head and asked, "Does the marshal know about what I did?" "Of course not." "In which aspect?" "The Grand Border City." "Oh, I do know about this." Nodding slightly, Z said calmly, "A few days ago, I decided to leave the Grand Border City to reinforce Tsang Yan's defense area. Then, you passed this news to Onros and requested for the 2 armies to be stationed there. After receiving my approval, you moved most of the soldiers from Zichen's and Tsang Yan's armies to the border of the defense area. Only your trusted soldiers were left to guard the city gates." Lei Erfu's eyes slowly closed. Even though he knew that all of his plans had been seen through after his identity was exposed, when Z explained everything clearly, a trace of shock and sadness appeared on his face. "Marshal, you gave up on the Grand Border City?" "Yes and no, cough cough." Lei Erfu coughed a few more times as his face turned red. "Before, when I announced that I would be moving one of my armies to another place, it wasn't actually true. They are currently stationed in a mountain range 50 miles away from the Grand Border City. When the barbarians enter the Grand Border City, they will immediately take over the 4 satellite cities and clear out your trusted soldiers. They will also block the barbarian army from behind. Laer Fu furrowed his brows. This can only block the attacks from the outside. What about the barbarians inside the Grand Border City? Although I don't know who is leading the barbarian army, whether it is Marshal in 2 or the Vice Marshal, they will at least have a few thousand soldiers. Laer Fu waved his hand and interrupted. It is Tu and a total of 8,000 barbarians. And Laer Fu couldn't help but reveal a surprised expression. It had to be known that he had been with Z for the past few days. Furthermore, the route of the barbarian army had changed. In other words, they were now a lone army and hadn't received any news from behind. Seeing Laer Fu's confusion, Z smiled and explained, "Haha, this is easy to guess. If we look at the distance, Anglos, who set out first, is undoubtedly the fastest to arrive. However, he is very calm when leading an army and has a cautious and suspicious personality. All right, to be honest, Anglos and I have fought for more than 10 years. Even if we don't fight in secret, we have fought face-to-face a few times, and he has never won. And he is a bit afraid of me. Although entering the city is tempting to destroy Zichen's headquarters, from another point of view, it is also a lone army. He doesn't dare to enter the city. Therefore, it is natural that Tu, who has been circling around Zichen's defense area, is the first to enter the city. Of course, this is only a guess. We will have to wait until we pass through the checkpoint in front of us and circle around to the location I showed you on the map. And according to our original route, it is the place where we're most likely to be ambushed. Only then will we be able to confirm whether or not my old friend is waiting for me there." Laer Fu's throat moved slightly as he shook his head with a bitter smile. Although Z was only guessing, Laer Fu, who was familiar with his personality, knew that if he wasn't 80 to 90% sure, he wouldn't say it. As for Tu and the 8,000 barbarians in the city, they won't have the chance to run into the center of the defense area. When they leave the Grand Border City, they will find 100,000 soldiers waiting for them. Impossible. Laer Fu shook his head and said in disbelief. 100,000? There aren't that many Zichen soldiers around the Grand Border City. Don't forget, Laer Fu was also a member of the Zichen Legion and a general. Previously, Zichen's army had retreated at the last minute. Furthermore, he had left with Z that afternoon, so he didn't have time to verify it. However, the other Zichen's 7th and 8th armies that didn't have any reinforcements were indeed around the defense area, not to mention whether or not they could make it in time. Even if they did, there wouldn't be 100,000 soldiers. It's 100,000 soldiers, but might not be Zichens. As he said that, he saw Laer Fu's expression freeze. Z continued. More accurately, it's 100,000 soldiers from the 4 lords in the north. When did I contact the 4 lords? Do you remember God's Grace Day last year? I had made a trip back to Shanghai City, and at that time, you were preparing to attack the Grey Yi army. The 4 lords didn't listen to orders, so naturally, their soldiers weren't easy to borrow. Even if it was an order from the king of Blanda City, they still dared to play some tricks and half-heartedly deal with it. However, as long as they were in the north, they had to give face to Z, much less visit him personally. Kiki. Laer Fu shrugged his shoulders dejectedly and sighed. So the marshal predicted today's situation and made preparations. What's funny is that I didn't know anything and was so cooperative. No, it's not like that. Z shook his head and sighed. Phew. I don't care if you believe me or not. Even if I knew your real identity, even if I knew about the trouble you would bring to the brand by smuggling the mountains of resources in the northern wilderness, cough cough, before I returned to Shanghai City last year, I didn't have any plans. You know that my body has been getting worse and worse these few years. At most, I can only hold on for 1 or 2 more years. Originally, I was planning to stay in the Grand Border Fortress until I died. Pause for a while. He looked at the shocked Laer Fu. With your current spy level, your position in the northern wilderness shouldn't be low, so you should know some things about me. And at least you know that I return to Shanghai City every God's Grace Day. That's right. I set up a chest stall there, just like how she did 10 years ago. Oh, I also set up a mocking sign, chuckling. Z seemed to recall something. She looked very happy. I set up a chest stall there for 14 years. I told myself that if I lost one day, I would go to find her. Last year, on the last day of Grace Day, I lost, and I was convinced of my loss. I don't know if it was God's will for me to lose in the last moments of my life and fulfill my wish. Following which, I visited the four lords and borrowed troops. When I returned, I immediately started a large-scale attack on the smuggling and sealed all the smuggling routes you opened. And, just like what I said before, the food in the northern wilderness is too lacking, and we relied on your smuggling routes to develop to such a stage. Now that I have cut off all these routes, they are undoubtedly being choked by the throat. As expected, Anglos led the entire tribe to launch an attack. See, Laer Fu sucked in a cold breath. Even with the calmness he had forced out over the past 10 years, he felt his scalp go numb, and his body felt like it had fallen into an ice cellar. Who would have thought? The current life and death situation on the front lines was actually controlled by Z from behind the scenes. As the saying goes, flipping one's hand to summon clouds, flipping one's hand to summon rain. Hung, hung, hung. Just as this side was in a short period of silence, a series of explosions broke out not far away. Laer Fu instinctively turned his head and realized that the soldiers of the 9 armies had already launched their attacks. The intense explosions came from those weird-looking weapons. Beside each weapon, there were 2 soldiers half kneeling on the ground. One of them opened the metal door of the black box and placed in the oval-shaped explosive crystal before closing the metal door. The other soldier adjusted the angle and pressed a small wrench. Boom! The weapon vibrated and a streak of fire shot out of the metal tube. Then, the wall a few miles away suddenly exploded. The whole process only took a few seconds. Before Ralph realized what was going on, the next exploding crystal was filled up again. In just a few minutes, in the continuous explosion, the wall of the small checkpoint far away suddenly collapsed, raising clouds of gray fog. The line of defense was broken. Kill. A short and cold roar sounded. The soldiers of the 9 armies in black armor silently charged forward. Under the cover of dusk, the shadows of the soldiers were like a flood of darkness, unstoppable. There are too few experiments. The accuracy is still lacking. Looking at the completely destroyed wall, Z muttered in a low voice. He seemed to be a little dissatisfied. Laer Fu's mouth twitched a few times. Although he hadn't seen the close combat performance of the soldiers of the 9 armies, based on the scene in front of him, he no longer had any confidence in Shuai. Shaking his head and looking away, Z turned around and asked, "Do you have any other questions?" Taking a deep breath, Laer Fu suddenly grinned and revealed a bright smile. "One last question. What do we do inside the Grand Border City?" His body shook as Z stared at Laer Fu. His expression was a little sad. With such a big mouth movement, there was no doubt that Laer Fu had already bitten off that poisonous tooth. He sighed slightly. "Tu won't be able to get anything. Do you still remember the old soldier that guarded the gate in front of my house, old Jill? When a city is broken, he will set fire to the house." "I'm asking." Laer Fu interrupted as a streak of dark red blood appeared on the corner of his mouth. His expression was still calm. "What do we do with the thousands of brand citizens in the city? I know Tu's personality, and I'm sure you know it too. He will definitely choose to slaughter everyone in the city." Slightly nodding, Z didn't deny it. He squinted his eyes. "There's not enough time. I prepared this plan too quickly. Plus, I have to hide it from your eyes." Cough, cough. Z's body trembled, and she coughed violently. However, she forcefully suppressed it. She bent her body and looked into the distance. Her expression was strange. "I have protected them for more than 20 years. Now, I just want to selfishly fulfill my wish before I die. Just for this. Thank you for answering all my questions." Phew! He opened his mouth and spat out mouthfuls of black blood. However, Lei Erfu's lips were still curled up. He forced himself to give a thumbs up. "Ha, Marshall, phew, you really are a lunatic," he muttered as his pupils dilated. Then he closed his eyes and fell on his back. Stepping to the side, Z hugged Lei Erfu's body and let the black blood stain his purple fur coat. After a while, he didn't move at all. He was like a statue in the twilight. His soft words scattered with the wind. "Actually, I'm not crazy. I'm just a coward who doesn't dare to face reality." Chapter 565. Under the warm light of the south, a colorful butterfly spread its wings and flew away from the delicate flower petals. Unbeknownst to them, on the sea level thousands of kilometers away, a thunderstorm was rolling and huge waves were reaching the sky. If Tang Yin knew that the current situation on the front line was actually caused by an inconspicuous game of chess last year, would he still shamelessly cheat to defeat Z? He didn't know. There were no ifs in history. Of course, even if the current Tang Yin knew about this, he wouldn't have any time to lament about it. Early morning. In a small patch of dense forest, the light of dawn slanted through the gaps between the branches. Dust floated in the air, and the air was quiet. Oh, it couldn't be said to be quiet now, because in addition to a few crisp chirps of birds, a strange singing voice sounded in an unusually discordant manner. "La la la, the sun is shining. The flowers are smiling at me. The little bird says, 'Good morning. Why are you plucking my feathers?' I'm eating you. You don't know yet. Light a fire and roast quickly. The aroma is coming out." The rhythm was warm and cheerful, and the style of the song was catchy. It was very cheerful. Looking for the source of the song, it turned out to be in the middle of a small patch of dense forest. There was a bonfire burning here, and an unfamiliar young man with a tired face was sitting in front of the fire, holding a wooden stick with a fat bird skewered on it. He rolled it from time to time, and the smoke rose in spirals and the aroma wafted out. Needless to say, this young man was naturally Tang Yin. The reason why he was unfamiliar was because he had disguised himself after taking off the black mask. At this time, the immoral singing changed again, and it turned into a rap. "Oh, the early worm is eaten by the bird. The early bird dong, 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 dong. Ah, eaten by me, huh?" Tang Yin paused suddenly, and suddenly turned his head to the left. Rustle, rustle. Amidst the soft footsteps, a handsome figure holding a long spear slowly emerged from the trees. His expression was cold and murderous. The cheerful chirps of the birds in the forest also stopped abruptly at this moment. "Here it comes again." Tang Yin rubbed his nose and raised the 80% cooked fat bird in his hand. Have you eaten?" Crack, crack. Amidst the sound of bones and flesh separating, the roasted fat bird was split into two. Tang Yin swung his arm and threw half of them at the other party. Pooh! Before they could even get close, the other half of the fat bird was accurately pierced by the spear. He approached the bird and sniffed it a few times. Then, he cast a glance at Tang Yin and stopped in his tracks. He took down the other half of the fat bird and ate it quietly. TSK. So the Temple of Light isn't just for show. Tang Yin opened his mouth and took a bite of the tender bird meat. He chewed a few times and swallowed it directly. Then he smacked his oily lips. Only then did Tang Yin turn his head to look at the other party. Then he laughed mockingly. That's right, this murderous newcomer was the Temple of Light's flower of nights, Sylvia. Compared to Tang Yin, Sylvia's table manners were more elegant. Of course, that was only in comparison. She was not as particular as a noble lady who chewed and swallowed slowly. In fact, her eating speed was not much slower than Tang Yin. She swallowed the piece of meat in her mouth, raised her head, and said calmly, "God said that we must treat, respect, and love all life. But some things are not abominable. They can be eaten." Shaking his head, Tang Yin heard this and was very disapproving. "Why are you so particular? My mother said that as long as the spine is pointed upwards, you can eat it." Sylvia heard this and was slightly startled. She seemed to be shocked by these domineering words. "Hey, you've eaten. Let's negotiate." His shoulders slumped. Tang and looked a little helpless as he spread out his hands. "Big sister, it's been 3 days. Can you stop chasing me?" Yes, since the start of the chase in the canyon, Sylvia had been chasing Tang In for 3 days and 3 nights. During this time, neither of them had taken any rest. Moreover, Tang In did not know how Sylvia was doing. But this meal of bird meat in front of him was indeed the first time he sat down and ate a complete breakfast in the past 3 days. At first, Tang In thought that with his speed and some time, it should not be a problem to get rid of Sylvia. In fact, this was indeed the case. In terms of pure physical speed, Sylvia could not keep up. But don't forget that Sylvia came from the Temple of Light. Although she was known for her domineering strength, she also knew and could use some secret techniques of light. For example, the angel-like wings of light that appeared behind her from time to time. As long as this thing was on, Sylvia's straight-line speed was not inferior to Tang In's at all. In addition to this, there was an even more fatal problem. After 3 days of running, it was naturally impossible that Tang In did not have any chance to get rid of her. After all, even if it was a secret technique, it could not be used all day long. But as long as Tang In managed to get rid of her, Sylvia would be able to catch up again in a short while. The result was the same again and again. Tang In also knew that there was a problem on his side. First of all, the problem could not be the traces of his escape. Tang In still had this much confidence. Was it the intuition of an expert? Sensing the aura? It had to be said that although these things sounded very illusory, they were indeed real. Tang In himself had such an ability. But this was only sensing. It was possible to use it occasionally, but the probability was not 100%. After eliminating this possibility, the only possibility was the faint white light that Sessman left on his arm before he died. Tang In was not very familiar with magic, but after the experience of being targeted by the spatial eye, he was not too surprised now. Obviously, Sessman had left this kind of tracking magic on his arm. Knowing this, Tang In was helpless. Although there was a certain distance limit to the tracking magic, Sylvia's speed was not much slower than his. It was impossible for her to run 100 miles in a short period of time. And what was worse was that if he could not get rid of this tracking magic, he could not go back directly. He could not even run to places with many people. After all, the power of the Temple of Light was too great. For a time, there was no place for Tang In this vast world. Glancing at him, Sylvia did not directly answer Tang In's question. Instead, she said calmly, "In the canyon, the person who controlled the thunder god's roar was you. For great deacons of light, 1 inspector of the 4 directions, 1 cardinal vice-bishop, 3 paladin commanders. I don't care who you are, what kind of status you have, what kind of strength you have. Even if you have to go to the ends of the earth, you will definitely die." Her words were calm, but coming from Sylvia's mouth, there was a kind of firmness that could not be moved by 10,000 mountains. Hiss! Hissing a few times, Tang In put down the bird meat and touched his nose. Not that many people died, right?" Xiao Weian lowered her eyes and didn't say anything else. She said these words just to show her firm attitude, but in a sense, it was also a praise for Tang In's sudden attack. So naturally, she did not want to talk more. Tearing off a piece of meat, she pondered for a while and raised her head to ask, "Including this time, you have tried to assassinate us 4 times. I want to know, as a brand, why do you hate the Temple of Light so much? Don't be like that, big sister. You can eat meat indiscriminately, but you can't accuse others of something so big." Waving his hand, Tang In slightly curled his lips. "I just want to assassinate Sessman. As for the Temple of Light, well, I don't have a good impression of them, but I can't afford to provoke them." "Why?" It's a long story." Scratching his head, he looked at the bird meat in his hand that he hadn't finished eating. Looking at Xiao Weian, he nodded. "All right, there's still time, so I'll tell you a story. The story of a young man who was determined to save thousands of people from disaster and revenge. Haha. A long, long time ago, well, last year, now that Sessman was dead, Tang In naturally did not mind telling her about the incident in Little Rock Village. Although the beginning of the story was very grand, it was indeed very simple. In just a few minutes, the story came to an end. A peaceful little farm, a few hundred innocent villagers, turned into ashes overnight. TSK, TSK, the Temple of Light, the Temple of Light. Of course, this has nothing to do with me, but it's Zeisman's fault for meeting me when I was full of righteousness. Isn't this a tragedy? Frowning, Sylvia subconsciously shook her head, obviously in disbelief. See, you won't believe me even if I tell you. Tangen grinned and continued. Sessman did a great job. All the victims were wiped clean, so it's impossible to find any solid evidence. But, well, I remember the day before the incident. It was your Temple of Light's Sunday prayer meeting, and there were civilians from the surrounding villages who rushed over. TSK, TSK, you can go and investigate. Little Rock Village was peaceful a day ago, but in just one night, there was an invasion of evil. Haha, would you believe it? All right, Sessman also has many Guardian Knights around him. If they haven't all died yet, then they should be the only witnesses to this incident. You can use torture to force a confession out of them, and you'll definitely know if it's true or not. But I'm afraid that when you know the truth, you won't dare to announce it to the world. Listening to Tang Un's harsh and sarcastic words, Sylvia lowered her head slightly, frowned, and fell into deep thought. She had to admit that Tang Un's words were reasonable. Moreover, the clues he provided were the kind that could be verified with a simple investigation, so there was no point in fabricating them. After a moment, Sylvia pursed her lips and said, "After we go back, I'll investigate this matter." Tang In was overjoyed. "Oh, that's great. Farewell. I won't see you off." Now, she plucked a few broad leaves from a nearby tree, wrapped the remaining half of the breast, and put it in her arms. She looked up with a determined expression. "My mission is to kill you and avenge the lords." Cha! Tang In rubbed his forehead with a conflicted expression. "Sister, don't be like this. That was just an accident, and we're not far from the border. If we keep running, we'll soon step into the northern wilderness." She raised her spear. "I've said it before. You'll definitely die no matter where you go." As soon as she finished speaking, she suddenly dashed forward, and her cold spear pierced toward him. F***CK. Tang In, who was already prepared, instantly flipped over and kicked the bonfire. Whoosh whoosh. Many sparks flew towards Sylvia's face. He quickly retreated. "You're too unkind, woman. Give me back the half of the bird." Chapter 566. Morning, Brand Border. As the first line of defense against the invasion of the northern wilderness, the Brand naturally attached great importance to it. Therefore, a city wall that stretched for thousands of miles from east to west came into being. This project was extremely huge. From the beginning to the end, it took the Brand's generation to complete. As a result, this king, who had been mediocre during his reign, became a hot topic in history. When the future generations evaluated his achievements, they would definitely talk about this achievement. However, in the years that followed, there were many facts that proved that this achievement was just a random decision made by the mediocre king. It could be said that once the barbarians from the northern wilderness attacked, this part of the city wall would be the first to be taken down. It was the same every time, without exception. The city wall that Bran had placed high hopes on had been reduced to a useless existence in the end. It was truly embarrassing. Of course, this time was no exception. This part of the city wall belonged to Song Yan's defense zone. Looking at the current situation, it was obviously occupied by the barbarians. The sound of a whip being whipped could be heard. "Cowardly Brandog, I'm talking to you. How dare you slack off?" Pa. Continuous whipping sounds. "Get up, don't play dead on the ground. What are you looking at? Go back to work. If we can't fix it today, we'll all die." The unclear Bran words were mixed with a few screams. About 50 barbarians walked back and forth on the city wall with a ferocious look on their faces. They were supervising the Bran laborers who were covered in dust and wearing ragged clothes. A large part of the city wall had collapsed. Under the supervision of these captive Bran laborers, they carried stones, mud, and other materials to repair the wall. In fact, the reason why the city wall collapsed was because of the barbarians' attack. However, it was a time of war now, In order to prepare for a rainy day, the barbarians naturally treasured the city wall that belonged to them. Thinking about the original intention of building the city wall, it was really ironic. Don't hit me again, don't. A Bran was lying on the ground. His back was badly mutilated, and he was being mercilessly whipped by the barbarian's whip. At first, he could still scream a few times, but soon, all that was left was moaning and his body trembling weakly. This situation didn't last long. Soon, under the orders of the barbarians, two laborers lifted up their dying compatriot, walked 100 meters away, and threw him into a hole that had been dug not long ago. At the bottom of the pit, there were already several Bran people lying on their stomach or on their backs. Their faces were ashen, and their bodies were stiff. There were no curses, complaints, or resistance. The Bran laborers were still expressionless, and the barbarians were still patrolling around with whips in their hands, as if what had just happened was nothing out of the ordinary. At this moment, what's that? It's the Bran. A burst of bewilderment rang out, and there was a small commotion on the wall. Soon, 50 barbarians gathered in one place, and narrowed their eyes to look at the wilderness in the distance. The Bran laborers below also noticed the change in the atmosphere. Their hands paused, and their empty eyes subconsciously looked behind them. A few miles away, two figures were running towards them, one in front and one behind. They should be chasing each other, because the two figures were entangled with each other from time to time. Sometimes, the white figure behind would catch up with the former, and they would separate again after a short fight. Sometimes, the black figure in front would suddenly stop, turn around, and pounce on the latter. They were entangled with each other, but neither of them could do anything to the other for a while. Both of them were extremely fast. Although they were fighting and stopping, they had arrived in front of each other in the blink of an eye. Damn it! Damn Bran people, stop! God, it's the Lord of the Temple of Light. Two different exclamations rang out at the same time. The former came from the ordinary barbarians on the wall. Although they were simple-minded, they knew that the other party was not weak when they saw the aggressive posture. So, they couldn't help but panic a little. The latter came from the Bran laborers who looked numb. When they saw the white figure approaching from behind, they recognized that it was the unique, holy, fighting energy of the Temple of Light. They were ecstatic and hurriedly called for help. The two figures were getting closer to each other, and they were only a few hundred meters away from the wall. Suddenly, more than a dozen barbarians on top of the wall knocked their bows and shot their arrows with a whistling sound. Almost every barbarian in the northern wilderness was a qualified archer after years of hunting. Although they didn't shoot many arrows, they were extremely accurate. Unfortunately, they still underestimated the speed of these two people. The arrows flew behind the other party and didn't serve as a warning. Before the second round of arrows could be released, the figure in front had already rushed to the corner of the wall. Well, it was a Bran youth. Bang! The Bran youth jumped on the wall without any hesitation. His body quickly jumped up. Then, he took a few steps and walked on the smooth wall like a gecko. He climbed up steadily. The wall was more than 10 meters high. The youth approached the top of the wall in an instant. However, he didn't have enough strength to climb up and was about to fall down. Suddenly, he turned his right hand, and a blade light flashed. He pressed it against the wall. Puff! Paused for a while in the air. Then, he jumped up again. Whoosh! Amidst the exclamations, the figure had already leaped to the outside of the wall. The 50 barbarians were on the top of the wall. They looked down and saw the youth climbing the wall like a ghost. They couldn't help but open their eyes wide in shock. A few of them regained their senses and gasped. They didn't have time to think and subconsciously smashed the iron rod in their hands. Get lost, the youth shouted in a cold voice. He opened his hands and gently pressed the iron rod. Then he pushed it out. Borrowing this force, his body suddenly soared into the sky. The two barbarians who were being held down by the iron rod staggered. They took half a step forward and then retreated as if they had been hit by a sledgehammer. Then, they raised their heads and fell to the ground. A small group of barbarians behind them rolled on the ground like a gourd. Fu**K. The youth quickly landed on a battlement. He turned around and said with a bitter face, "Sister, don't chase after me. If you chase after me, we will enter the northern wilderness. It's okay if you don't want to live, but I don't want to accompany you on this journey in my prime." These two people were naturally Tang, In, and Sylvia. After chasing for half a day, they finally arrived at the border of the Bran. If they continued forward, they would enter the real barbarian territory, the northern wilderness tribes. Once they stepped into that territory, Sylvia and Tang In, who were from the Bran. Well, Tang In wasn't from the Bran, but with his physique and language, he was one in the eyes of the barbarians. There was no doubt that if they were discovered in the northern wilderness, they would be attacked by all the barbarians. If they went deeper into the northern wilderness tribes and entered the site of the big shots, then they would have no chance of survival. This logic was very simple, and anyone could understand it. But the key point was, would Sylvia listen to him? Obviously, she wouldn't. Humph! Xiao Weian snorted coldly and did not reply to Twain at all. She narrowed her eyes and scanned the surroundings. Her gaze paused on the group of Bulin laborers for a moment, and then she suddenly took a step forward. The fighting aura around her body surged and soared like a tide, and a blazing flame leaped up from her long spear. She raised it high up in the air, and wantonly and enchantingly. In the next moment, she became one with her spear and struck the collapsed wall. Break! Boom, boom, boom! In an instant, gravel flew everywhere and dust filled the sky. This part of the wall had already collapsed. Although it was repaired by the Bran laborers, it gradually regained its original shape. But the repaired part hadn't dried yet, and the glued part wasn't firm enough. Now, with the continuous violent explosions, the tens of meters tall wall finally couldn't withstand Sylvia's tyrannical ravaging and collapsed like a building block. Ah! Ah! Exclamations sounded one after another. It turned out that the 50 barbarians on top of the wall were too close to the collapsed area. They were caught off guard and fell together with the rubble and tiles. At such a height, and with the huge rocks falling from the top of the wall, the fate of these barbarians could be imagined. Seeing this, Tang In's mouth twitched a few times. He scratched his head, and his expression was very complicated. "Damn, you win." Then, without saying anything, he turned around, walked a few steps, and jumped down from the other side of the wall. He went straight into the northern wilderness. Boom! Almost at the same time, this side of the wall exploded. Without waiting for the bricks above to fall, Xiao Weian, who had directly completed the domineering traverse from the ground, rushed out with her gun. Without the slightest hesitation, she followed closely behind Twain. A cold wind blew, and the dust dispersed. Hundreds of laborers in the Bran stood in the same place. First, they looked at the pile of rubble. The 50 barbarians who were whipping them were completely crushed under the rubble. They didn't move at all. Then, they turned around and looked at the 10-meter-wide wall. Through the cracks, they could even see Sylvia's figure in the northern wilderness gulp. They all swallowed their saliva. Then, an excited shout came from somewhere. "We're free!" Coming back to their senses, the laborers looked at each other and shouted in unison. Then they scattered in all directions. Chapter 567. Happy people were all alike, but unlucky people had their own misfortunes. Just when Tang In had to escape to the northern wilderness, there was also a tragic person who was about to cross the Bran border and retreat to the northern wilderness. The similarity was that both of them were forced to do so. The difference was that Tang In was seeking death by retreating to the northern wilderness, but he was going home, or rather, going back to his hometown. His armor was broken, his helmet was crooked, and his usual calmness was gone. Now, Ongros was in a mess and confused. Even from the attack last night until now, his mind was still in a muddle-headed state. Around him, the original 5,000 barbarians that he had brought with him were now only 1,000 or so injured soldiers. Their faces were filled with fear, and their morale was low. "Marshal, Marshal!" After a few calls, Ongros turned his head and saw a low-ranking barbarian officer standing in front of him. He lowered his head and reported, "Marshal, we've reached the Bran border." "Oh!" Angros heard this and nodded subconsciously. Then, he came back to his senses and looked at the low-ranking officer in front of him. His face darkened again. If it was in the past, it would be the middle-aged lieutenant standing in front of him. However, in last night's battle, in order to cover his escape, the lieutenant put on the marshal's armor and fought to the death. He was trapped in a tight encirclement. After all, Angros was a veteran marshal who was used to life and death situations. He took a deep breath and quickly woke up from his negative emotions. He looked up at the brand border wall, not far away, and fell in a deep thought. Seeing this, the low-ranking officer boldly said, "Marshal, should I send someone to get some soldiers here? With this tall wall, we may be able to defend ourselves." He shook his head. "It's too late. Even if we can mobilize enough people in a short period of time, the city wall won't be able to withstand the strange artillery fire last night." At this point, Angros seemed to have recalled something. His wrinkled cheeks that were covered with age spots twitched a few times. He was in pain and fear. Last night, because he knew the route and predicted that Z's army would arrive at this time, Anglos had been sitting in the middle of the army after dinner, waiting for news. At the same time, he was also silently calculating the possible variables in the plan, whether there were any loopholes in the ambush, how Z would react, and so on. After some calculations, and Shuai couldn't help but feel relieved. There were tens of thousands of soldiers in front of them, forming a tight encirclement without any loopholes. At the rear, there were 5,000 of his soldiers guarding the rear, waiting for an opportunity to reinforce the various areas. No matter how one looked at it, it was an inescapable net, absolutely foolproof. However, all of these meticulous arrangements instantly fell apart after the sound of a cannon being fired came from the rear. Unexpectedly, Z didn't come from the front. Instead, he had circled around to their rear and successfully launched a surprise attack. Then, everything turned upside down. The tens of thousands of soldiers in the front had become mere decorations, while the 5,000 barbarians in the rear had fallen into chaos under the constant bombardment of the cannons. Anglos had tried to organize some soldiers to counterattack, but they had instead become the important focal point of the enemy's fierce bombardment. After several rounds of earth-shattering explosions, the soldiers had suffered heavy casualties, and even his position had been exposed. Anglos still couldn't figure out what was going on with the cannons. He was very familiar with the large and small military equipment of the Brand. In fact, he was even more familiar with them than the Brand quartermaster. However, even if he racked his brains, he couldn't think of any heavy weapons that could be easily transported into the mountains. Moreover, even if Z had used manpower to carry the Thunder God's roar, it would be absolutely impossible for him to change the direction of the cannon in an instant and bombard the barbarians from all directions. The army was defeated like a landslide. In fact, the 5,000 barbarians had already been completely stunned by the bombardment of the cannons before they even saw the enemy. They didn't even know where the cannons would explode. Anglos himself was also thrown into the ravine by the blast wave and almost lost his life. Following which, when the guards pulled him up, the cannons finally stopped, and the enemy had also begun their attack. Following which, the mountains and plains were filled with flames, the bodies of the barbarians with missing limbs, and the soldiers in black armor were like a dark flood. Blood splattered everywhere, and screams filled the air. It was like a nightmare. "Marshal, Marshal!" Seeing that Anglos was in a daze again, the low-ranking officer called out uneasily, "HM? Oh." Anglos pinched the bridge of his nose and tried to focus. After a while, he opened his eyes and said, "Pass down my orders. The troops are to cross the city wall and continue forward." "Yes." "Also, send people to circle around and reach the Grand Border Fortress as soon as possible. Tell Tiu to retreat quickly. That's all. Go." "Yes." Z didn't follow the original route and ran into the encirclement. Instead, he even launched a sneak attack. Anglos could naturally tell that something was wrong with Ralph. If he thought deeper, the Grand Border Fortress should also be a trap. Of course, if that was really the case with Z's terrifying methods, it would be too late to inform Tiu now. However, Tiyu's identity was special. No matter what, Anglos had to try. Even if it was just a gesture, he could still explain to the Northern Wilderness Empress in the future. After organizing his thoughts, he made sure that he didn't miss anything. Anglos took a deep breath and turned his head to look behind him with a solemn expression. Oof. Z, you win this time. However, the Grand Border Fortress has been destroyed and tens of thousands of civilians have died. I want to see how you explain this to the brand. And that's right. You must be thinking that only by killing me will you be able to make up for your crimes. Z, follow me into the northern wilderness. Even if I have to sacrifice my life, I will make you stay. Anglos' prediction was right. In reality, before he was attacked, Tiyu was already in a difficult situation. The fire in the Grand Border Fortress burned for a few days and nights. By the time it calmed down, the fortress had already been reduced to a pile of rubble. Along with it, tens of thousands of civilians and nobles had also fallen. Regarding this matter, the Songyin army and the Thunderbolts army both used the same strategy and tried their best to prevent news from spreading. However, a few days later, this lockdown was completely broken and news of the Grand Border Fortress's fall spread everywhere. However, just as the Brand civilians were in disbelief and the Zichan defense region was in a state of panic, the Grand Border Fortress's army suddenly appeared. The 100,000 soldiers of the Four Lords descended from the sky and forced Thup back into the ruins of the Grand Border City, who wanted to continue his attack on Buran. It was undeniable that the Grand Border Fortress's army was a bit lacking. However, with such a huge difference in numbers, it was more than enough to deal with them. At the same time, Zichan Defense Region's army had also silently taken over the 4 satellite cities. Like this, they had cut off Tiyu's path of retreat. They couldn't advance, nor could they retreat. What was even worse was that the Grand Border Fortress had already been destroyed by Tiyu himself. It was impossible to even defend it. Without a doubt, this was a true danger zone. If there were no accidents, Tiyu and the 8,000 barbarians would all be wiped out here. Since their lives were saved and they didn't have to face the flames of war, the Brand civilians naturally let out a long sigh of relief. After the sudden reversal of the battle situation, some people began to understand some things. The Zichan Legion had announced that they would reinforce the Songyin Defense Region, the Grand Border Fortress's destruction. The Grand Border Fortress's army that had appeared out of nowhere, and the Zichan army that had quickly returned such a meticulous plan, step by step, one after another. Who else could it be other than Z? After understanding this point, Z, who was previously worshipped by everyone, immediately became the target of curses. That was the logic. No matter what Z's plan was, using the lives of thousands of civilians, the situation of the front line, and the safety of the entire North as a ruse was definitely a heinous crime. Furthermore, what kind of target could bear such a price? Killing the barbarian commander? Or killing the Northern Wilderness Empress? Wasn't this bullshit? If he could really do this, why would he wait until today? For a moment, all sorts of theories were being spread. However, the front line was really troubled at the moment. An unexpected incident suddenly broke out and instantly attracted the attention of some well-informed people. They were extremely shocked. It was said that more than 10 important people of the Temple of Light had died on the battlefield. Among them were the cardinal vice-bishops, the 4 Directions patrol envoys, a few great deacons of light, 3 Holy Knight commanders, and a number of low-level clergy. This kind of news was undoubtedly shocking to the point of being flabbergasted. Even if one did not talk about status, these were still 3 Earth-stage warriors and 6 great magicians. The fall of such a powerful force, no matter which organization it was a huge loss that was enough to shake the world. Furthermore, such a big shot like the Songyin old commander knew some things that were not known to the public. At that time, the Songyin soldiers who were charging at the bottom of the canyon were the first to realize that something was wrong. They clearly saw the physique of the Brand people and heard the pure Brand accent. If that was the case, then this matter was a little strange. Why would the Brand people attack the clergy of the Temple of Light? Of course, this matter involved the Temple of Light, after all, so even the Songyin old commander did not want to be involved too much. In the end, He only ordered people to gather information and temporarily transferred the soldiers involved to the rear, waiting for the people from the temple to deal with it themselves. Or perhaps, when Sylvia, who had chased after them, came back, the truth would naturally be revealed. However, the Tsang old commander did not know that the so-called truth was actually right under his nose, after being blocked by tens of thousands of Tsang soldiers. David and the rest, who knew that it was impossible to catch up with their boss, immediately turned back and met up with Fry, who was at the checkpoint. When they met up, David did not hide anything and told Fry the truth about what happened. After hearing that this matter had become so big, Fry was so shocked that he could not speak for a long time. However, now that it had happened, it was useless to say anything. After some discussion, everyone finally decided to stay at this checkpoint. Firstly, they had to put on a show. If they just left at such a sensitive time, it would be hard to avoid suspicion. Secondly, they wanted to wait for Tang Un to come back. Their line of sight was drawn to the north, all the way to the northern wilderness. Strictly speaking, the two things that caused a huge uproar were directly or indirectly related to Tang Un. However, he could not even take care of himself now, so naturally, he would not be so bored to think about it. After running out of the Brand border and entering the northern wilderness, there were no special changes to the landscape. This was the Brand's wild land that was described by word of mouth and countless books. However, in Tang Un's eyes, it was similar to the desolate northern Brand, sparse and normal. However, Tang Un's feeling instantly disappeared after crossing a wide mountain range. His field of vision suddenly became extremely wide. The sky was still the same, but there were almost no clouds. As far as the eye could see, the sky in the distance was like a pure light blue crystal, making people feel relaxed and happy. Not only the sky, but the ground was also the same. There were no more continuous mountain ranges, only a vast expanse of wilderness. The weeds were yellowed, just enough to reach shoes. Unknown wild flowers decorated the landscape, swaying with the wind, giving it a unique charm. Tang Un threw his head back and laughed. This scene made Tang Un, who was used to seeing the concrete and cold buildings of the modern world, feel a lot more comfortable. He was instantly possessed by a scholar and poet. First, he boldly leaped up and let out a long whistle. The sharp sound pierced through the clouds and shook the wilderness. Then he touched his chin and thought for a while, then opened his arms. See, you are all water. Horse, you have 4 legs. Grassland, you have hair. Ba ba ba. The rhythm seems a bit wrong. Let's start again. After thinking for a while, he looked up at the sky for a moment, then looked down at the weeds next to his feet. Finally, he scratched his head with a constipated expression on his face. Damn, it's not my specialty. There's a big difference between holding a dagger and holding a pen. Shaking his head, Tang Un reluctantly gave up the original idea and smacked his lips. Okay, then I'll plagiarize one. Well, no one will come and sue me for infringement anyway. TSK, what should I plagiarize? He nodded his head, still a little distressed. Tang Un was a slacker who dropped out of a third-rate university. He knew a lot of strange things, but he couldn't remember anything serious. At this moment, he couldn't even remember the glorious content of the 9 years of compulsory education. Finally, when Tang Un pulled his hair for the 3rd time, he remembered a ballad in a hurry. He suddenly looked up and laughed. Wah, I got it. I'm really a genius. Ahem. He coughed a few times to moisten his throat, then opened his arms again to hug her. The sky is vast. The wilderness is boundless. The wind blows the grass lowly. F*CKU. The broken gong-like singing suddenly stopped, and he suddenly turned around, only to see Sylvia, who was a few hundred meters away, rushing towards him with a murderous look on her face. All the leisure and elegance disappeared in an instant. Except for cursing, Tang Un didn't say anything else and ran forward. He had been chased for several days, and a man was being chased by a woman. This was undoubtedly something that hurt his self-esteem. But if this woman's name was Sylvia, then everything could be explained. It wasn't that Tang Un didn't resist, although it was impossible to assassinate him because of the light magic brand on his body. But Tang En wasn't the same as before, and his strength had been advancing by leaps and bounds. But after several head-on confrontations, Tang En had to admit that Sylvia's current strength was indeed higher than his. This woman was indeed one of the so-called genius warriors in this world. Of course, Sylvia looked at Tang En's back in front of her, thinking the same thing. This wasn't the first time Sylvia fought with Tang En. In fact, they had already fought head-on twice. The first time was when they had just arrived at the peak of a mountain in the north. At that time, the other party was no match for her at all, and she could easily send him flying. The second time was at a banquet held by Dao, an expert of the savage evil cult. Tang En gave Sylvia a huge shock, and she found that she could no longer take him down easily. Even in a short period of time, the two of them could fight to a draw. The final outcome of that disastrous banquet had undoubtedly proved this point. The other party had taken advantage of her killing Dao and had directly shattered the divine armor on her body. Now, this was the third time she had fought with him. Although it was somewhat hard to believe, Sylvia had to admit that the other party's current strength was on the same level as hers. Although in a head-on confrontation, she could indeed suppress the other party by a bit, but if she was careless and made a small mistake in battle, the other party would definitely have the ability to kill her. Furthermore, it had only been a little more than a year since these changes had occurred. It could be said that in Tang En's heart, Sylvia was a genius. Then in Sylvia's heart, Tang En was an out-and-out evildoer. No way. No matter what, I have to kill him this time. Thinking of Tang En's rapid improvement in strength, Sylvia could not help but feel a little apprehensive and fearful. At the same time, she secretly made up her mind that no matter what price she had to pay, she had to kill the other party and nip the danger in the bud. Tang En, who was sprinting, did not know that Sylvia had already made up her mind to kill him. Looking at the boundless grassland around them, he could not help but frown. Needless to say, in such an open and unobstructed terrain where one could see a few miles away, it was undoubtedly not conducive to escaping. TSK, do I really have to run until I collapse from exhaustion? Helplessly shaking his head, Tang En tried to convince her with virtue as he ran. I say, Beauty, if we continue running like this, we'll be in big trouble. Hey, don't say that I'm threatening you. If the barbarians find out, I'll be fine. I'm not that bad. I'm a brand at most, so I won't attract much hate. But you're from the Temple of Light, and you're quite famous. How can the people from the savage evil cult let you go when they get the news? TSK, woman, have you ever thought about the consequences of being captured? This was the truth. The Temple of Light and the savage evil cult were like fire and water. Because of the issue of faith, the hatred between the two sides was even greater than the hatred between the Bran Empire and the Northern Wilderness tribes. As long as they met, it would definitely be a matter of life and death. It could be said that as long as Sylvia's whereabouts were exposed, the savage evil cult would definitely not let go of the temptation of capturing the flower of the Temple of Light's night alive. Don't worry about it. Even if it really comes to that, I'll kill you the moment before it happens. Sylvia's expression did not change at all as she replied coldly. She still tried to persuade him earnestly. Don't. Even if you kill me, you won't be able to run away. It doesn't matter. Besides, it's not worth it. God said that it's our duty to purify the heretics, even if we have to be smashed into pieces. Rubbing his forehead, Tang En grimaced as if he had a toothache. You keep talking about God, and you keep talking about God. God is your father. Why do you listen to him so much? No, God is the father of my believers' children. We should worship God as our master. He opened his mouth, but he was speechless. Then he gave her a thumbs up. You win. Phew. I hate to reason with women like you who have big boobs and no brains. P.S. Merry Christmas. Chapter 568. Of course, the Northern Wilderness couldn't only have boundless grassland. If that were the case, then the barbarians wouldn't have such a serious food shortage. After running for half a day and night, Tang In finally walked out of the grassland the next morning. Even with Tang Un's abnormal physique, he couldn't help but feel weak in his legs. His body swayed, and he almost fell to the ground. He had been running for 4 or 5 days. He had picked up some things to eat along the way, but he had never closed his eyes for more than half an hour. Even if his body was made of iron, he wouldn't be able to withstand such torment. He turned his head and looked behind him. He had finally gotten rid of Sylvia by running at full speed just now. Phew! Tang and let out a long sigh and slowly sat down on the ground. He reclined on a slightly raised mound. Although his eyes were extremely dry and sleepy, Tang didn't dare to have any thoughts of closing his eyes. He gasped for breath for a few minutes and then struggled to sit up. He rubbed his numb calves and tightened his collar. He didn't know if it was an illusion, but as he went deeper into the northern wilderness, Tang In felt that the weather outside was getting colder and colder. After thinking for a while, he raised his right arm and opened his 5 fingers. He felt the biting cold wind cutting through his fingers. He grinned and withdrew his hand. Tang In confirmed that the temperature was much lower than before. He looked up and looked into the distance. He could vaguely see some hills. If he squinted his eyes and looked carefully, he could faintly see thousands of ravines and other terrible landforms. He then looked down at the slope of the mound. Weeds were overgrown and gravel was everywhere. These gravel weren't big and couldn't block the path, but walking on them was extremely difficult. If one wasn't careful, they would trip and roll down, breaking their heads and bleeding. This wild land was rumored to be unsuitable for human habitation. But now, Tang In and the other uninvited guests were gradually unveiling their ferocious veil. Damn it, this won't do. I need to make an animal skin to wear. Tang In did not recover from the short break. Instead, he was attacked by the cold wind that bypassed the mound from time to time. He shivered subconsciously and muttered to himself. After the harsh training in the system space, it was true that Tang In could resist the cold, but it did not mean that he was willing to suffer the cold. As he spoke, he groaned and forced himself to stand up. That woman's speed wasn't slow, and this amount of time was enough for her to catch up. Tang In didn't know when his life as a fugitive would end, but judging from the current situation, if either he or Sylvia couldn't fall, then he wouldn't have to think about this problem for the time being. Shaking his head with a conflicted expression, Tang In stretched out his arms and did a few stretching exercises. Then, with a long howl, he ran straight to the hills in front of him. As the saying goes, a mountain is far from a mountain. Even with Tang In's super speed, it took him an hour to reach the hills that were not too far away from him. His previous observation was not wrong. The terrain here was indeed very bad. There were hills in Bran, especially in the north, where there were countless of them. However, the hills in front of him were very different. It should be due to severe weathering. The mountains were strangely protruding, and it was not an exaggeration to say that there were thousands of ravines. Naturally piled up layer by layer, it looked a bit like terraced fields in the modern world. Not long after he entered, Tang In stopped and frowned as he looked at the ground. Naturally, there was nothing interesting about the soil, but if he squinted his eyes, he would find some small crystalline particles in it. When he stepped on it, it would make a rustling sound. Frozen soil. Tang In instantly realized what it was, and then he shook his head and sighed. No wonder. How can they grow crops in such an environment? It's impossible that the barbarians won't rob them. Of course, Tang In was just sighing casually. After all, even if the barbarians were all dead, it had nothing to do with him. However, just as Tang In was about to continue moving forward, his ears suddenly twitched. He raised his eyebrows and couldn't help but turn his head to the right. There was clearly some sound coming from there. Sylvia? Or a barbarian? Tang In listened carefully again and ruled out the possibility that Sylvia had chased after him. After all, she was only one person, and she couldn't have made such trivial noises. Tang In stood still and thought for a while. Then, he decided to go over and take a look. He jumped on the rock on the right side and jumped over a few low hills like a wild beast. He quickly climbed to the mountain side of the terraced field on the opposite side. He peeked out from behind a rock and saw that there were more than 100 men and horses marching on the narrow mountain path below. They were also wearing animal skins. However, they weren't wearing the barbarians' rags. Instead, they were wearing tailor-made clothes. The chests of the animal skins were bulging. With Tangen's eyesight, he could naturally see that there were sharp weapons hidden inside. Some of the people in the team were looking around from time to time. They seemed to be very vigilant. Brand people. Tangen raised his eyebrows in surprise. Then he saw the big and small bags on the back of the horses and nodded. There was no doubt that this was a smuggling caravan. Although the Bran and the Northern Wilderness usually had caravans going back and forth, they both took what they needed. But now was a special time, and normal business operations had been stopped. Instead, it was replaced by smugglers who dared to do anything for high profits. Ha! Seeing this, Tangen grinned and laughed silently. They really sent a pillow to him when he was sleepy. It seemed that his character was still very good. He walked out of the rock and waved his hand to greet them. Ha! Good morning, everyone. Hua! For Tangen, this situation was like meeting an old friend in a foreign land, and it was a happy thing. But obviously, the smugglers below didn't think so. When they heard the familiar Bran's words from above, it was like thunder exploding in their ears. Their bodies shook violently. Clang! 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 All kinds of weapons were instantly unsheathed and pointed at him. Don't be nervous. Don't be nervous. Slowly lowering his hand, Tang acted harmless and smiled. I just want to spend money to buy a coat made of animal skin. Hee. Aren't you also merchants? You could do business with anyone. I'm a Bran after all, so I hope you can give me a discount later. The people at the foot of the mountain were a little dumbfounded when they heard the familiar words of business. Then they saw that Tang was indeed from the Bran, and he was alone. They couldn't help but feel a little relieved. The profits of smuggling were very high, there was no doubt about it. But profit was always tied to a sharp knife, not to mention the smuggling that would send you to the gallows. It should be said that Tangen's request was very simple, and it wasn't excessive at all. But the smugglers who put their lives on the line naturally didn't think so. A Bran who appeared alone in the northern wilderness? And he even said that he wanted to buy an animal skin coat? It had to be said that this was really too strange. And strange often meant trouble. The nervous crowd looked at each other and finally looked at the center of the crowd. There stood an old man wearing a triangular black hat, who seemed to be the leader of the caravan. At this time, he was frowning and looking at the situation around him. Then, he looked up and sized up Tangen. He thought for a moment and waved his hand. Kill him. Looking at the dozens of powerful crossbows below him, Tangen grinned. Damn it. His figure instantly flashed behind a boulder. Whoosh, whoosh, whoosh. The arrows whistled and hit the surface of the boulder one after another. Bang, bang, bang. The boulder trembled and debris flew. In just a short moment, dozens of holes appeared on the surface of the boulder. This world, feeling the violent tremors behind him, Tangen took a deep breath and his face darkened. He turned around and took a step back. He lifted his foot and kicked the boulder. Bang! This is bad. Rumble. The boulder rolled half a circle and suddenly fell from the mountainside, straight toward the smuggling caravan at the foot of the mountain. Not good, Dodge. Oh, damn it. When the crowd at the foot of the mountain saw that a round of arrows had missed, they wanted to draw their swords and rush up, but unexpectedly, they bumped into a large shadow. Those who reacted quickly rushed to the side and rolled on the ground. Those who were in a worse position and slow reaction could only curse subconsciously as the boulder fell on them. Immediately, blood splattered 3 feet away. Those who had rolled to avoid the boulder looked up and saw a black shadow jump up from behind the boulder. They could not help but turn pale with fright. Be careful, he's coming down. However, their warning was already too late. Tangen quickly charged into the group, crisscrossing blade lights as he casually waved them out. Why didn't you do a good business? The caravan members only saw a blur in front of their eyes. Their throats, thighs, and chests all fell cold. Blood spurted out instantly, filling their vision. You forced me to kill. In an instant, screams sounded one after another. Some clutched their throats and staggered back before falling to the ground. Some hugged their thighs, arms, and other places and rolled on the ground, wailing. In that case, his figure passed through the dense crowd like a ghost. Paused for a while, he raised his hand and slapped away a caravan guard who tried to sneak up on him. Then, he suddenly stepped forward. Whoosh! The corner of his clothes was pulled into a line. He folded his palms and slapped on the body of a frightened black horse. Hiss! With a long and shrill neigh, the black horse was sent flying. Along with the goods that fell from the sky, it directly sent a dozen guards of the trade caravan who were holding crossbows but could not find a chance to attack flying. After doing all this, Tang clapped his hands and calmly took a step forward. He grabbed the old man, whose eyes were wide open and whose body was constantly trembling due to fear, to the point that even his triangular black hat had been shaken off. Tang punched him. Listen, I'm King robbing you. When reason did not work, the fist was often the truth. After the chaos, the smuggling caravan stopped on the mountain road. The caravan guards who were not injured were cleaning up the scene. Those who needed treatment were treated. Those who needed to be thrown away were thrown away. Those who were seriously injured and could only moan were carried to a hidden place to give them a stab. They were all doing the dirty work. With this awareness, they did not cause any more trouble. Animal skin clothes, hiss. I brought a few sets. I wonder if you, hiss, would like them? It was only a short sentence, but the old man with dark eyes spoke very hard. He endured the pain and gasped from time to time. The fawning smile on his face was a little distorted. Needless to say, the old man was naturally sullen. However, when he saw the mercenary group that he had spent a lot of money to hire being quickly defeated by the young man in front of him, he sensibly took out one of the goods he had brought this time, a few pieces of animal skin clothing. Tang looked around, and his eyes suddenly lit up. Even just by looking at them, he could see that these animal skin clothes were indeed expensive. These were not the inferior goods in the modern world that were said to be 100% animal skin, but in fact, they were mixed with many other ingredients. These were definitely real animal skin clothes. Other than the necessary needles and threads, the rest were pure animal skin. Obviously, the old man had spent a lot of money to prevent Tang from going crazy again, and to make up for his previous mistake. If these expensive clothes were to be transported to the northern wilderness, they would undoubtedly be sold to the rich and powerful. Therefore, the profit that it brought was naturally very considerable. TSK, the clothes are not bad. Tang touched the thick fur and smacked his lips. He was very satisfied. Waving his hand and making an inviting gesture, the old man's smile was more or less stiff. His heart was bleeding. Hee, as long as you like it, pick anything you like, hee. Thank you very much. There are not many clothes, a total of 6 pieces, and only 2 of them were for men, 1 black and 1 brown. From this, it could be seen that no matter which world it was, women's money was always the easiest to earn. At this time, his sight swept over a piece of female clothing. Tang's plumb eyebrows couldn't help but raise, and the corner of his mouth rose. Oh, this piece of clothing is so domineering. Leopard print. It was indeed a female leopard print that was similar to the modern world's trench coat. Take note, this was a real leopard print. The old man smiled apologetically and said, yes, only those uncivilized barbarians like this style. Tangen's words were not sarcastic, but he couldn't help but feel a little emotional when he saw clothes that were similar to the modern world's fashion. But it was obvious that the current brand people's taste had not reached that level. Looking at this style that resembled a Dalmatian, they would only feel that it was vulgar and ugly. Shaking his head with a smile, Tang didn't explain much. He picked up the black animal skin clothes that resembled a cloak and put on, and looked at it from head to toe. It didn't fit, it was a little too big, and it looked a little like a cloak. This was normal. After all, these clothes weren't originally made for the brand people, but were custom-made according to the barbarian's tall and sturdy physique. Although it didn't fit well, there was nothing to say about the degree of warmth. After buttoning it up, the cold wind that invaded his body suddenly disappeared without a trace. Tangin didn't have a better choice now, and after putting on the clothes, he didn't plan to take them off. Since his goal had been achieved, he naturally had to leave as soon as possible. As for the smuggling caravan in front of him, Tangin had no interest at all. If the old man hadn't attacked first, Tangin wouldn't have been short of money, and he would have left after buying the clothes. Haha. Well, I wish the boss a prosperous business. After taking a few steps, Tangin was about to wave his hand and leave, but his eyes once again swept over the conspicuous female leopard print clothes. His footsteps suddenly stopped, his eyes rolled a few times, and then he turned around again. By the way, boss, how much is this dress? The old man was stunned, and then he hurriedly waved his hand. This dress is free of charge. It's free. Not mine. He pointed to the other clothes on display. I'm talking about these. Well, you know, who doesn't have relatives or friends? My second uncle's third brother-in-law's fourth uncle. In short, there are more people. I see that your clothes are good, and I want to buy a few more. Boss, you can name a price. What? The old man was confused by the tongue twister of relatives, and when he came back to his senses, he caught the main point. His old face instantly turned pale, and his lips kept trembling. Damn it, this black-hearted bastard actually has his eyes on all the clothes. While cursing in his heart, the old man regretted his stupid move of putting all the expensive clothes on display. But things had already come to this, and he couldn't beat him, so it was naturally impossible for him not to bleed. His face twitched, and he forced out a grief-stricken smile, stuttering, Since you like it, just take it. There's no need to talk about money. How can that be? Frowning, Tangin's expression was very serious. Isn't this robbery? We're all reasonable and civilized people, and we're compatriots. As the saying goes, when you go out, you make friends from all over the world. How can I do something to cheat a friend? How about this? I also know that boss has good intentions. I have to buy this dress, but if I give you too much, it's undoubtedly not giving you face. His hand fumbled around in his pocket, and then he grabbed the old man's hand and opened it. A gold coin shone under the light. Then 1 gold coin, everyone's happy. Opening his mouth, the old man looked down at the gold coin in his trembling hand and didn't say anything for a long time. 1 gold coin? Spit on your face. Not to mention the finished clothes. Even these raw materials were not enough to buy 1% of the clothes. The old man was now in a state of extreme anger, but now the situation was better than him, and he could only swallow his anger. When he came back to his senses, he had to sullenly reply, Thank you, you're welcome. Waving his hand, Tangin naturally didn't care about the old man who wanted to cry, but had no tears. He unceremoniously picked up the 4 pieces of clothes, and with a thought-provoking smile, he walked away. Bang! 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 As soon as Tangin's figure disappeared, the old man fiercely threw the gold coin on the ground. His old arms and legs suddenly jumped up, and he kept stepping on the gold coin on the ground. His old face was red, and his lips trembled. Damn. Bastard. Oh, my precious clothes. I'll die a horrible death. I ran into the barbarians when I went out, and I'll be smashed into meat paste. Just as the old man was tossing and turning and cursing Twain, suddenly, a voice rang out. Hua! Another commotion sounded from behind, and the degree of the commotion was even greater than the commotion caused by Tangin. Exclamations rose one after another. The murmuring curses suddenly stopped, and the old man only thought that the bastard had turned around again. He quickly bent down to pick up the gold coin, and once again put on a crying face. But as soon as he turned around, his body suddenly shook, and he was completely dumbfounded with his mouth wide open. On a hill not far away, a figure holding a spear was rushing over. If it was a normal time, the caravan guards would have already stopped him. But now, they really didn't dare to, because the figure was wearing a silver white armor, and they couldn't be more familiar with it. It was the exclusive equipment of the holy head knight of the Temple of Light, God's armor. When she arrived, Sylvia put away her spear, and the fatigue on her face and the gray color from the cold wind were obvious. What remained unchanged was her eyes that seemed to be eternally determined. She couldn't help but frown when she saw the situation. With Sylvia's rich experience, she could naturally see that the people in front of her were smugglers. But this kind of thing was not her business, and she didn't have the time to care about it. Sylvia frowned because Tang had run away again. She could sense that the light tracking magic was already a few miles ahead. Taking a deep breath, Sylvia was about to continue forward, but her eyes swept across the crowd, and her footsteps couldn't help but stop when she saw the conspicuous leopard skin clothes. With her strength, if she used her combat energy, she naturally wouldn't be afraid of the cold. But when facing Tang In, who was at the same level as her, she naturally couldn't use her combat energy in such an insignificant place. And if she didn't use her combat energy, there wasn't much difference between an expert and an ordinary person. At least in this kind of climate, she was still afraid of the cold. But the leopard skin, after thinking for a few seconds, Sylvia pursed her lips and still walked over. She didn't look at the people who were hurriedly avoiding her and walked past the stunned old man. She directly used her spear to pick up the leopard skin clothes, and without saying anything, she turned around and left quickly. That figure vaguely looked a little embarrassed. Chapter 569. The chase and escape continued to play out. Because they had entered the hilly area, the terrain was extremely complicated. Tangan was like a fish in water. He changed directions crazily, leaving no trace behind. Although Xiao Weian relied on her light-sensing magic to follow closely behind him, she couldn't close the distance between them in such a short time. Another day passed, and the two of them seemed to be playing a game of hide-and-seek. They didn't even see each other once. It was only at this time that Tang In felt that yesterday's robbery was 2F King wise. At noon, the sky was dark. There were no clouds, nor was there a gloomy sun that was more symbolic than practical. There were only white catkins that fell silently to the ground, swirling and drifting in the raging wind. That's right, when it was close to noon, it started to snow without warning. The snow wasn't heavy now, but according to the cold weather, it wouldn't be long before it started snowing heavily. Russell. He patted his shoulders and jumped a few times on the spot, the snow falling from his body. Tang touched his thick fur coat and rejoiced. Damn, luckily I was prepared, or else it would be a tragedy. Then he thought of something, raised his eyebrows, and smiled. Oh, the flower of Knights of the Temple of Light. What a holy title. Let me think. No, just imagine a serious and dignified, beautiful face, a strong and graceful body, and a bright and holy Do Chi, and finally a domineering leopard print outfit. Wah! I can't take it anymore. I can't take it anymore. Imagining Sylvia wearing the leopard print dress that he deliberately left behind, Tang Un's whole body twitched as if he had epilepsy. He hugged his stomach and spun around, unable to control himself. If it wasn't for the snow, he would have rolled on the ground and laughed wildly. Ha! I'm really looking forward to it. I can't wait to go back and observe it. After the joy, Tang Un's tiredness dissipated. Then he gathered his emotions and continued to move forward. Tang Un did not know where he was now, but he was sure that he was deep in the northern wilderness. After crossing the hills, he found an abandoned wooden house in the dense forest. There were some moldy animal skins in the house. In addition, he found a few crude but very useful traps in some places. There was no doubt that these were left behind by the barbarians when they went hunting in the mountains. After discovering this, Tang Un was certain that he had arrived at the outskirts of the barbarian's residence. This kind of news was naturally not good. Whether it was from his physique or his vague language, Tang Un did not look like a barbarian. Once his identity was exposed, trouble would follow. Pretending to be a mute barbarian, Tang Un thought about how he could blend into the interior of the northern wilderness without being discovered by the barbarians. However, after thinking for a while, he couldn't help but frown. If he only had to disguise himself as a normal barbarian, it wouldn't be a problem for Tangan. When he was surrounded by Tiyu's army, he had successfully disguised himself many times. However, the problem now was that he was not the only one who had entered the northern wilderness. Because of the light tracking magic on him, no matter where he hid, Sylvia would be able to find him. Therefore, if Sylvia was exposed, then he would definitely not be able to escape. After thinking for a while, Tang-en was shocked to find that he was tied to the same rope as Sylvia. He imagined that after they were discovered, he would have to deal with the crazy woman on one hand, while being chased by countless barbarians and experts from the savage wilderness on the other hand. Damn it! Holding his forehead, Tangan's expression was very conflicted, and he could not help but curse. At this moment, coo coo coo. A few chirping sounds suddenly came from the ravine not far away, mixed with some unknown shouts. It was very chaotic and noisy. Tangan's footsteps paused, and he looked to his left. His heart skipped a beat, and he bent down to feel his way over. This was a low and undulating ravine, and gravel was scattered all over the place. When Tang-en arrived, the noise had not completely disappeared. After looking around, Tang-en could not help but raise his eyebrows. He saw a figure lying on the ground with his back facing him in a ravine. From the simple animal skin and the black hair on his bare arms, he could tell that this was a barbarian. Well, to be more precise, this should be a barbarian child. Although his physique was sturdier than some adults in the brand, he was still much shorter than the normal barbarians that Tang-en had seen on the battlefield. Soon, Tang-en found the source of the noise. It was a pheasant with beautiful, colorful feathers. However, this pheasant was very panicked at this moment. It was being chased by another barbarian child, and it kept chirping as it flapped its wings and flew towards Yang Ling. Seeing this, Tang-en nodded, and a look of understanding appeared on his face. This was a simple hunting operation. One child was responsible for driving away the wild animals, and the other child was hiding in a predetermined location. When the time came, they would either rush out to surround the wild animals or seize the opportunity to kill. Oh, it should be killed. Tang-en looked at the hidden barbarian child, and his body slowly leaned forward. He tightly held a fist-sized stone in his hand. Hurrah! When the panicked pheasant was about 10 meters away from them, the barbarian child suddenly stood up, roared, and threw the stone fiercely. Whoosh, wow! Beautiful! Tang-en raised his eyebrows and silently praised. With his eyesight, he could naturally judge that the stone would hit the pheasant's comb without a doubt. Sure enough, bang! Coo! The pheasant suffered a heavy blow to its head. It whined and flew out in an instant. However, due to the age of the barbarian child, the strength of the stone was still too light. The pheasant didn't die immediately after it landed on the ground. It struggled to get up before the two children rushed over. The comb of the pheasant was full of blood, and it couldn't tell north from south. Coo, coo, coo! Every barbarian was an excellent hunter by nature, even if they were children or women. Tang-en recalled Fry's emotional words when they were chatting. He couldn't help but nod in agreement. A stone hit the comb of a fleeing pheasant from 10 meters away. This wasn't a simple matter. To be specific, it could be compared to when Tang-en had just arrived in this strange world. He held a simple crossbow and hunted for a long time, but didn't manage to shoot down a pheasant's feather. Wu Liwala, the pheasant's fighting strength wasn't strong, but its vitality was commendable. Although it couldn't tell the direction, the two children couldn't stop it, even though they anxiously shouted in barbarian language. Coo, coo, coo. Suddenly, the pheasant seemed to remember that it had the ability to fly for short distances. It flapped its wings and soared into the sky, flying towards the top of the gully. The two barbarian children became anxious when they saw this. If the pheasant flew to the top of the gully, it would be long gone by the time they climbed up. They quickly picked up the stones on the ground and threw them at the pheasant. However, in a moment of desperation, they lost their aim and all the stones missed their target. They could only watch the pheasant approach the top of the gully. Coo! Suddenly, the pheasant seemed to be choked by something. Its wings stiffened and it fell straight down. Bang! It fell in front of the two children, who were stunned. Wah! Ha! After being stunned for a moment, the two barbarian children saw that the pheasant had suddenly recovered. They thought that the pheasant had used up all its strength and fell down. They immediately pounced on it and pressed it firmly on the ground. At this moment, the pheasant stopped struggling. Its feathers rustled, and it trembled in fear. It allowed the two children to bind it tightly with vines. Undoubtedly, the two children were very excited to have successfully captured their prey. They were very excited at first and talked a lot. Then, they giggled and walked towards the north. When the two children's figures disappeared, Tang In walked out from the top of the gully. He pondered for a few seconds. Then, the corners of his mouth rose, and he followed them. Of course, he didn't want to kill the two barbarian children. Tang In thought of an idea. He was worried that he would be exposed and would attract a large-scale pursuit from the northern wilderness. Then, wouldn't Sylvia also be worried before she killed him? If he disguised himself and entered the interior of the barbarian gathering place, there shouldn't be a problem. However, Sylvia wasn't good at disguising herself. In order to prevent her identity from being exposed, she could only stay outside. In this way, wouldn't he be able to temporarily avoid being hunted down and have a good rest? Thinking of this, Tang In, who hadn't slept for almost a week, made a decision. Of course, he had to find the barbarian gathering place first. And the two barbarian children in front of him were undoubtedly the best guides. Therefore, in order to let the two children return quickly, Tang In released a cold, murderous intent towards the pheasant as a small reward. You're tuning in to the Warrior Lore YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.